Good evening and welcome to the February 16th, 2021 regular meeting of the Mayor and City Council. First item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'm going to ask Councilmember Sesma to lead us in the pledge tonight. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you. Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mike. Next item on our agenda is reflection. And I wanted to call everyone's attention to the passing of two very important people in our community. Tammy Rode, who was friends with just about everybody you see on the screen, and an active and positive presence in our community, and Glenn Paulman, who's the former chair of the Kentlands Community Foundation. Also a great contributor over the years to our community, a good friend to many of us, and we are heartbroken to lose them. And so, like all of us, to think of them as we take a moment of silence, please. Thank you very much. Next on our agenda would have been the minutes, but there is going to be a revision upcoming to the February 1st minutes, and so we're gonna defer those this evening and come back, bring them back next time when Doris has them ready. And so the next item on our agenda is appointments, and we have, let's see, several appointments to several different committees. And I'm going to ask, what is the pleasure of the council? Mike, go ahead.
Mr. Mayor, I want to move a resolution listing, confirming your appointments, reappointments and appointments to various committees. I'll read through them. To the Economic and Business Development Committee, terms to expire February 2024, John Lynn and Eric Morrison. To the Planning Commission, this is a 5-year term. Phil Wessel, term to expire in February 2026. To the Community Advisory Committee, a 2-year term, Jennifer Jackson, term to expire February 2023. Also to the Community Advisory Committee, Wallace Simmons, term to expire February 2023. To the Educational Enrichment Committee, Althea Lloyd White, her term to expire February 2023. To the Gaithersburg Book Festival Committee, this is an indefinite appointment, term to expire, Serena Augusto Cox and Leonard Levy, also known as Lenny. And to the Old Town Advisory Committee, also an indefinite term, Jay Horowitz.
Thank you, Mike. Ryan.
Second.
Okay, I will call the roll. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed say nay. Councilmember Sesma.
Aye.
Councilmember Wu.
Aye.
Councilmember Harris.
Aye.
Councilmember Sales.
Aye.
And Councilmember Spiegel.
Aye.
All right, carries unanimously, and we will thank all of our volunteers when we see them. Next, we are going to have, tech team, if you could bring up Janice Hartman and Nate Bassett from our finance department. We're going to have a presentation, our financial update related to FY 20, 21, and 22. And I'm going to turn it over to Tanisha to lead this with our finance team.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Tonight, we're going to spend some time reviewing our financials as we prepare to move into the heavy lifting of the budget process. We are breaking out what would have normally been presented at your Mayor and Council retreat, which is scheduled for next week, into smaller bites because sitting on Zoom is becoming old and tired for most of us. So we're trying to break up some of the material that we'll be going over. And we thought it would be fitting to start with an update on our finances, especially how they have been impacted by COVID-19 as the foundation of our budget process. This evening, I have with me Acting Finance Director Janice Hartman and Senior Budget Analyst Nathan Bassett to help address any questions if necessary, to completely jump in and cut me off if I say something incorrect. We've been working really hard alongside each other for a few weeks now, and I really appreciate all they've done. And I also want to give a quick shout out to Deputy City Manager Dennis Ingslinger and Assistant City Manager Tom Lonergan, who have also been really instrumental as I get up to speed on Gaithersburg's financials and historical trends. So as we know, COVID-19 has impacted every aspect of our lives and has touched every private business and public organization in some way. As we prepare for our next year budget, I did think it was important that we start by level setting our expectations with an understanding of how our revenues have been impacted and the forces that will likely continue to shape them as we move toward pandemic recovery. It is important to note that we are early in the budget process, and at this point in time, we're using about 6 months of data in our current fiscal year in order to project forward. We do expect to continue to refine these numbers as we move closer to budget adoption in June. And between now and then, we will have the mayor and council retreat next week, and we will continue work on the city manager's proposed budget to be presented by the end of March. There'll be a budget hearing in April, along with several budget work sessions as we move toward adoption. So I would ask the tech team to bring up the presentation, please. Thank you. And next slide. So just a quick overview of the agenda. We're going to focus on our financial position. We'll review the budget numbers for the previous fiscal year, our budget to actual numbers for the current year, and our projections for the next fiscal year. But first, we'll start with a little terminology. Next slide. This may be review for some of you, but we want to make sure we're all on the same page, especially as we have some guests this evening from the public listening in. So that said, also, if I use an acronym or a term tonight that's not familiar, please stop me and I will clarify. Next slide. So we'll start with funds. I'll be referencing this a lot. That's a separate pool of money dedicated to a specific purpose. So the accounts of the city are organized into funds, each of which is considered to be a separate accounting entity. This is typical in governmental accounting. Gaithersburg has 6 such funds plus a trust fund for employee benefits. Next slide. Fund balance, it's just what it sounds like. The amount of money available after accounting for all revenues and expenditures in the previous year. The fund balance is further categorized by assigned and unassigned, which is important. We can't use the assigned money, even though it appears to be available. Each fund has a fund balance, and our current policy is to keep at least 25% of the average of 3 years of expenses in unassigned fund balance. We are a pay-as-you-go community, as you know, and so our reserve approach will and should be conservative to ensure we are able to self-fund all of our projects now and into the future. The current policy is a best practice. However, the Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA, who sets these guidelines for us, has established some new guidance on fund balance policies, and we will be reviewing those to determine what adjustments should be made. Next slide. Other post-employment benefits, or OPEB. OPEB are benefits other than pensions that U.S. states and local governments provide to their retired employees. These benefits principally involve healthcare benefits, but also include dental and life insurance. These benefits are a key element of the city's overall benefit package, which helps in recruitment and retention. The liability is determined based on actuarial assumptions of our plan participants, and we seek a new valuation every 2 years with outside consultants as dynamics change. So now that we've gotten some review out of the way, let's dive right into our fiscal year 2020 results. Next slide, please. And next slide. So we'll start with revenue. And we'll start with the general fund, which is our largest operating fund, and most services are funded out of this fund. Overall, for fiscal year 2020, we collected $66.2 million in revenue. As you can see from the chart, our most dominant sources of revenue are local taxes or property tax, and the category listed as taxes county shared, which is income tax. The two combined reflect 71% of all revenue received, which is on trend for us. The next largest category of revenue is miscellaneous. This category includes mostly non-recurring revenues, which means the revenues are coming from less predictable sources like interest income and/or one-time sources like competitive grants or reimbursements. The next largest category of funding is charges for service. The majority of the revenue in this category comes from fees that we collect for parks, rec, and culture programs and events, other activities along those lines. Licenses and permits down at the bottom of the donut comprise 6% of all revenues collected last year. And this category is mainly building permit fees. Next slide, please. All right, so it looks like a busy and a scary chart, so we'll walk through this a little bit. I do want to pause for a moment and mention that it may seem like we're skipping slides as we move through the presentation in order to provide as much written information as possible in the packet for the community. Separate slides were created following some of the chart slides in order to provide the additional details of what I'll be speaking to. On this particular slide, we'll examine the fiscal year 20 performance versus what we budgeted for 20. For the non-budget finance folks listening in, the city follows a July 1 through June 30 fiscal year. That means that the beginning of the pandemic, or the first half of calendar year 2020, fell into the last 6 months of fiscal year 20 for us. We might expect our budget variances to be significant since the budget was adopted half a year prior to the emergence of the first case of COVID-19. That said, the city's fiscal year 20 revenue actuals were very close to the original budget, or about 0.4% variance from the budgeted amount, if you take a look at that last line on the slide. With all of the red numbers on the chart, which reflect negative variances from budget, at first glance, it would seem unlikely that we would have trended so closely to budget. And so let's just spend a little time unpacking that a little bit. Although overall revenues approximated the budget, the real story is at the bottom of the chart, or the miscellaneous revenues. We received, and in fact were carried by, significant one-time sources, with the largest source being interest income. It was up $1.7 million over what we budgeted just in the interest income category alone. We did see a 3% increase in real estate taxes, which is a recurring source of revenue, and that was consistent with historical trends. We'll talk a little more about real estate taxes later, but I will say that this is a source of revenue, that this source of revenue would not have immediately been impacted by the pandemic. Some of the declines in revenue were the result of delayed distributions, meaning we would have normally received disbursements for income tax, for example, before June 30th of 2020, but due to different delays with offices being closed, the tax filing extension, things like that, did slow some payments up that we actually ended up booking into the next fiscal year. So that does explain some of those changes. However, we did have direct impact from the pandemic and other categories that we'll dive into. Next slide, please. Sorry. Next slide. So that was the revenue side. On the expense side, we're still in revenue. We're going to take a look now at our FY19 actuals versus our 20 actuals. So trying to compare a somewhat normal year to the year where we experienced half of the year in a shutdown mode for the pandemic and see how we fared. So when we look at the 19 versus the 20 actuals, and we look at that last line of the chart again, you will see that we are slightly down about 1.8% or 1.2 million when we compare year over year. We did have some declines in recurring sources. As I mentioned, a lot of those were the results of delayed payments, but some of the direct impact came from licenses and permits fees as property and projects slowed down, development slowed down, in some cases came to a screeching halt. So building permits, business licenses, those sorts of things. Charges for service, of course, a huge chunk of that was parks, recreation, and culture programs and special events that were not able to go on. And you will note the miscellaneous revenues show a favorable variance, meaning that 20 increased over 19. And that was also because 2019 was an exceptional year for interest earnings. So that's not a normal year for us, but definitely helpful and has helped to shore up some of the disruption from the pandemic.
Tanisha, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Obviously, the number of grants from county government's way down. And we're comparing actuals to actuals. We didn't budget 1.7 million. We budgeted like 192,000 or something from the county. But I was curious, did we end up getting some of the COVID relief funding? Did they end up sharing some of that with us?
We have been able to submit for reimbursement to the county. We have not yet had those disbursements, so they will show up in this current fiscal year. We've submitted all of our paperwork, and Janice, I don't know if we've heard anything about when we'll receive it. I do know that some of the communities who have submitted their information to the county has been reimbursed. They're just kind of moving slowly through that process.
Right. We did hear that it was approved, but we have not yet received the payment.
Okay, so that'll show up in 21. All right, thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. No problem. And there is a big shift there on the county grants. Some of that also was we received a one-time reimbursement for the Teachers Way project that was apparently done a very, very long time ago. And we were able to, thanks to Dennis Enslinger, get a distribution from the Transportation Development Tax Fund. So that's why that category looks a little out of whack as well. All right, next slide. And next slide. So when we look at the expenditures for 2020, in anticipation of the revenue declines and as a result of operational changes due to the pandemic, we did end the year about $4 million under budget on the expense side. The spring season for Parks, Rec, and Culture was essentially canceled, which impacted revenue, but it also meant a decrease in spending. We did unfortunately need to furlough 325 part-time employees who were active at the time. And we also managed a lot of vacant positions by holding them open to realize some savings there. Major purchases were delayed, projects were put off. As you all know, planned travel and training came to a full stop. And we also saved in overhead costs because people were working from home for a good portion of that time frame, which saved on things like utility costs. Next slide. So the bottom line for 20, the adjustments to our planned spending in the second half of the year more than offset the revenue impacts that we experienced for fiscal year 2020. In fact, the fiscal year 20 budget included the planned use of 2.1 million of fund balance, but ended up contributing about $2 million to the fund balance when it was all said and done. With the unknown future fiscal impacts of the pandemic, growing the fund balance helps to better position us to minimize further disruption in service delivery. And your prudent fiscal decision-making has and will continue to pay off. I do think we're well positioned to weather this storm. It will be a challenge and we will have to make some adjustments, but certainly not facing catastrophic things. Next slide. So this slide illustrates the fiscal health of our general funds fund balance. And we'll talk about that a little later as well. So the red bars show the budgeted amount of fund balance to be reappropriated each year. So what we plan to spend down in the fund balance compared to the thin line, which shows what actually happened to the fund balance from year to year. So over time, we've planned to spend much more of the accumulated fund balance than we've ultimately used. When revenues come in higher and expenses lower than budget, the planned reappropriation was decreased or in some cases eliminated altogether like we did in this last fiscal year. Since fiscal year 2016, we have used about 14.1 million of the fund balance. The vast majority of this planned use was for investments in our capital needs, such as the creation of the stormwater fund, the asset replacement fund, and the housing fund, and increases as well as additional transfers to the OPEB fund to address the liability, which we'll touch on later. Next slide. So we are going to shift now to talk a little bit about some of the other funds. Briefly, I will stop and ask if there's any questions about fiscal year 20 with the general fund. No? Okay, we'll move on. Next slide. So starting with the capital projects fund, it accounts for the resources that have been assigned for new capital purchases and major projects. The main revenue source is a transfer from the general fund, along with occasional outside grants from the federal, state, or county governments that we receive. We will review the capital improvement plan during the budget work session in April to go into detail about current projects and planned projects for the next 5 years. At this time, the current fund balance is not adequate to fund the projects that have been identified as needs for the next 5 years and beyond. We will be working over the next year to refine the CIP and align the city's long-term funding needs with our estimated available resources. Next slide. The stormwater fund. So we added 5.8 million to the stormwater fund's fund balance, bringing it to 25 million total. The general fund continued its subsidy of 1.2 million in FY20. But that was eliminated for the most part in this current fiscal year. The current rate model is in its final 7th year, and it's currently being updated to meet the requirements of our MS4 permit, as you know, which is in its second year of a 5-year term. The anticipated capital funds necessary to achieve the total maximum daily load, or the TMDL, reductions under the city's MS4 permit requirements are less than initially anticipated, hence the larger balance. As a result, there will need to be some spend down of the current fund balance on needed projects, and the new rate model will reflect this spend down. And we do have another work session coming up on that where you'll get to see some more detail on those numbers. The city did experience also some staffing challenges over the past 2 years, which had an impact on the number of projects that can be completed. Now that we're at full staffing for the stormwater crew, annual spending and expenses will better correspond to the revenue generated. And the FY21 transfer, so this current year's transfer, only included the hardship costs. So as a condition of the program when we created it, hardship costs and the city's own fees for our properties. We made sure that if we had a hardship fund, that it would be funded out of the general fund. So if residents have trouble paying, they can apply, and we pay those funds out of the general fund through that transfer. We will probably do the same in 22 and going forward, as the new rate model will establish how much of a transfer is necessary. I don't believe, and staff doesn't believe, that we'll need to continue at the level that we were, but we will at a minimum continue to pay our own fee assessments for our properties and of course fund the hardship program. Next slide. The Asset Replacement Fund, this was also another recently created fund. It accounts for the money we set aside for the replacement of existing city equipment, vehicles, and other assets. The Asset Replacement Fund is also funded by a transfer from the general fund. And the set aside is critical to maintaining our assets. And we will also be reviewing this fund next year. So along with the CIP, it's a good time since it was created in FY17 to step back and take a look at our approach there and our assumptions and make sure we're still in line with what our future needs are. So we'll be reviewing that fund as well. Next slide. The Housing Fund is dedicated for housing initiatives in the Gaithersburg Home Buyer Assistance Loan Program, which helps us further our affordable housing goals. It is mainly funded through a transfer as well, but it also receives income as loans are repaid back over time. So you see this fund ended with a balance of 8.2 million, but this is one of those examples of there's a delineation here of assigned and unassigned. So about 5 million of that is already assigned and not, 5 million of that is payables. So the loans that will be repaid in the future, and 3 million is assigned for the sole purpose of supporting our housing initiatives. Next slide. Quickly, the Forest Con Fund, obviously it is what it says it is. It's got a balance of 760,000, and it helps us to further our urban forestry goals and to plant trees. The revenue from this, unlike the other funds, I think this may be the only one that it's not solely or majority funded by the general fund. The revenue source here comes from payments in lieu of the fee for reforestation. Next slide. And then quickly on OPEB, we've discussed what OPEB is, and the OPEB fund is where we account for the healthcare, dental, life insurance, and benefits for retirees. These dollars are kept in a trust, which ended the FY20 year at 20.6 million. It would require another 20.8 million to fully fund the outstanding liability of these future benefits. However, this is done over time and based on our actuarial valuation. So we do want to continue to work to lower that number, but it is not our approach at this time to bring that liability to zero. We have a pay-as-you-go approach to this fund as well. Next slide. So we're going to switch gears to the current fiscal year and take a look at how we're doing now and how the pandemic continues to impact us. Next slide. So what this chart is showing is our revenue collections through December of last year, so through December 31st. I've provided some historical detail in the chart. So you see there's FY19 and 20 year-to-date actuals. You have the budgeted amount for this current year, where we are in the current year, and the percent collected. The bottom row of the chart is a little deceiving. So as you think, as you would think that collection amounts over 50% at the halfway mark of the year would be a positive sign. But as you probably know, some of our revenue is cyclical. And in this case, you can see that we have almost collected all of the property taxes for this year. So the very top line at 98% collected. So we don't anticipate more there. When we start to look at individual revenue categories, we can get a better feel for how we are trending and the continued impact of COVID-19 on our projected revenue. At this time, it looks as though we will end this year down around 4.5 million, or 6% below what we budgeted for revenue. Sorry. At the time the current budget was adopted, there was less known about the duration of the pandemic. And though we could probably say the same for today, I think we were expecting some recovery in the second half of this fiscal year. This may still happen to some extent, but likely not enough to fully recover the projected declines. The good news is that our major recurring revenue sources are holding, And we are even projecting increases in income taxes and a slight increase in property tax. The other revenue categories are struggling a bit. So hotel, motel, and admissions taxes are only at 11% of the budgeted amount at this time. Respectively, they're down 61% and 90%. We'll talk a little more about that. Licenses and permits, we've talked about the sources of that, down 24%. Charges and services expected to be down 34%. And interest earnings probably won't save us this year, as we're currently earning less than 1%. So that is a little on the revenue side. Next slide.
Tanisha,
Mhm.
can I make one clarification? The 4.5 million that we're down, there is the 2.6 million that we plan to use for the reappropriation. So the revenues overall are only down, I think about 1.4, 1.5 million from what we had planned. So there was that 2.6 million in planned use of fund balance.
Thanks, Nate. And Nate will add that clarification on the next slide. You can go to the next slide, tech team. So this next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about expenditures. So the 4.5 million, as Nate noted, does include the budgeted reappropriation amount. So to compare apples to apples, we'll get to that. But the bottom line is we're still trending below our budget, and we hope to be able to recover that by lowered expenses. So as we look at our expenditures through December 30th, I'd ask you to look at that last column, percent expended. Again, generally speaking, we would expect that being at or below 50% spent for the year at the halfway mark for operations would be a good indicator. In some cases it is, but we also have some cyclical spending trends, whether it be public works with, depending on how the winter storms go, we can have additional overtime and contractual costs there. Parks, recreation, and culture, the majority of their season picks up in spring and early summer. So we do have those kinds of cyclical trends. We have cyclical payments as well. So that it may not always pan out that we would be at half spent at the half mark. That said, we do believe we're trending under budget, and we believe that we may be able to do so in order to meet or maybe slightly use some of the budgeted reappropriation. It would be my goal, if it's possible, for us to recover, to meet the projected decline on the revenue side by trying to find some reduced spending opportunities. That's going to come for us, of course, with personnel. So it is the greatest use, the greatest majority of our budget is spent on people, as it should be. And so the biggest savings come from things like vacancy management, which we've been doing all year long. Though there has been some positions approved, as we have a good feeling and hope that we'll be able to do some more outdoor programming, for example, coming up in the spring and summer, and we've got to get our staff in place for that. So we have been doing a bit more hiring, but we've had a freeze for most of this fiscal year, which has been very helpful. We continue to approach spending in a conservative manner, and there's a lot of curb spending. We prioritize for the pandemic, obviously, and we are seeking reimbursement, as Mayor Ashman reported. Parks and Rec and Culture spending closely tracks revenues, as we discussed. And so the cost savings are also connected to any canceled programs and events. So if we find ourselves back in that position again, we'll see some revenue decline there, but we may also see expense decline. Next slide. And next slide. So now we're going to shift to talk about the next fiscal year and our estimates. Next slide. We'll start with some historical trends. So this chart is comparing 5 years of all revenue collected in any given year, which includes any one-time sources that we would have received as well. And those are the bars, the blue bars. And then the thin line is showing our recurring revenue in a given year. So isolating out those one-time sources that are unpredictable, that we certainly don't want to match any ongoing expenses to. You see that huge dip in this current fiscal year, and that is a direct result of the pandemic's disruption to the economy, which in turn impacts our regular sources like charges for service and permit fees, as we discussed. And we also had some delayed distributions, as we talked about as well. You're also seeing some recovery in recurring revenue sources projected in the next year, which is anticipated to mostly occur in the second half of the fiscal year or the first 6 months of calendar year 2022. So our approach is to hope and do all we can to help with the vaccination rollout, to have our numbers continue to trend down so that some of regular activity can resume. And that will have a direct impact on us. The sooner that happens, the more we'll be able to do. But we are taking a conservative approach and assuming that we'll have a lot of virtual programming again this year. Likely no travel and things like that happening this year. If so, it will be very late in the year. So that's our approach with respect to the 22 budget. Next slide. So here are some of the assumptions. Again, interest rates, we will continue to anticipate those will be low. Our average rate is currently below 1%. There's still projected to be slow recovery in hotel and motel taxes and admission and amusement taxes. And our commercial valuations increased roughly 14%. We'll talk a little more about that, compared to 22% in 2018. But we are expecting some appeals as obviously everyone has taken a hit in this economy. And if someone's valuation has increased, particularly our commercial property owners, we anticipate that they may appeal that, and that will have an impact on our revenue. We are, as I said, projecting slow recovery in program revenue in early fiscal year 22, but expecting it to pick up in the second half of the year. And we are expecting income tax revenue to be flat year over year, which is actually a piece of good news there. So next slide, please. All right, so this pie is showing our 5-year average and just looking at the distribution of these revenue sources. That's an important piece to understand as we think about what factors impact our revenue sources and how much influence those particular factors will have on our overall ability to fund our services adequately. So again, back to a little good news. Our largest revenue sources are relatively stable, especially compared to other markets across the country. Lots of cities and counties that are relying on sales tax, for example, that are having to fill huge budget holes over multiple years. So for us, income taxes and property taxes combined shore up a stable base of about 70% of our budget for the last 5 years. We have enjoyed some boosts from one-time revenues, and because of this city's commendable financial management in the past, we've made wise decisions. With unplanned surpluses, we tend to make one-time investments in things like capital needs. So those are all good strategies and have positioned us well for today. Individually, charges for service, licenses and fees, fines and forfeitures don't have the same impact when we experience declines, but collectively, these sources account for 20% of our budget, and they have the ability to create considerable disruption in our funding with the direct impact from the pandemic. Next slide. So these are a few of the key indicators that we're going to continue to monitor as we refine our projections and get closer to final adoption of the budget. I'll spend just a little time on these indicators and then I can answer any additional questions you have. Next slide. So we have this great GIS map. The indicators we are evaluating for property taxes, of course, real property assessments. We're in a reassessment period right now. It's wrapping up and that data is actually still being analyzed. But preliminary results show a 3% increase across all non-exempt residential and commercial properties. 81% of non-exempt property assessment values went up. Great news. This map is showing the value changes throughout the city. The green shades show positive changes in value since the 2020 assessment, and the purple are negative value changes. Only 407 properties show increase or decrease larger than 10%, so that's a good number to work with. Property value increases are phased in over 3 years. So when we get a win, it's tempered a bit over 3 years, but any decreases are taken immediately. There's also a 10% cap on residential increases. So given the economic downturn, we do expect a significant number of appeals from commercial properties, as I mentioned, especially those who have shown increases in their value. And so we'll have to see how that plays out and continue to monitor that information. Next slide, please. And the next slide. And the next slide. Thanks. So hotel, motel, and admissions taxes. This chart really shows the story. You can see the 19 actuals, the 20 actuals, our 5-year average. Headed into this fiscal year, prior to the pandemic, we were expecting properties like Dave & Buster's to generate $1 million in taxes on their own. We're now looking at a proposed FY22 forecast of $500,000 in each category. And you can see the FY21 projection is even well below that as we struggle to recover with room rates and occupancies continuing to be down, travel still being difficult to do and scary to do, frankly, during the pandemic, and indoor movie theaters and family entertainment centers are also obviously significantly impacted. So we continue to monitor that number, and we've taken a conservative approach to what we expect in FY22. Again, thinking about the second half of the year. Next slide. When we think about income tax and what key indicators we follow there, of course, the major one would be the unemployment rates. And these charts are showing some historical trends for our unemployment rate in Gaithersburg. The great news is the number is starting to trend down, though we are not yet near the pre-pandemic levels after reaching a peak of 8.6% in July of last year. We don't have sector data by our locality. That's difficult to get for the locality, but we are anecdotally, we believe that the sectors most impacted are service sectors, and the wage levels there perhaps won't be enough to have a significant impact. And so as we are showing that year over year flat amount for income tax, we're not expecting any declines there. We also know that unemployment was taxed as well, so that's a little helpful for us, maybe not for the person who needed the unemployment. Next slide, please. When we think about permits and fees and what's happening there, obviously our development pipeline is important. And John and his team have reported some really good news that there are great projects in the pipeline. Many projects, as you know, were slowed or halted last year, and they're starting to get back on track. And there's several new proposed projects coming through the pipeline as well, which are really good signs of economic recovery for this city. The short-term impacts of construction-related activity and revenue are great for us, as well as the long-term impact of adding property value to our tax rolls. We anticipate these economic ramifications of COVID-19 to continue through the summer, as we mentioned, given what we know currently. There are several factors that can change this, such as a pickup in vaccine rollout, continuing declines in infection rates, and other things. And so we'll continue to keep our eye on the ball there. Next slide. Just a couple more charts. Next slide, we'll talk about our future outlook. I mentioned this before, it's going to be critical that we figure out how to balance our capital needs with our available resources headed into the future. So on the horizon, we are watching things like how do we catch up on some of our deferred and delayed projects and maintenance that need to get rolled into this already maxed out capital plan that we have for the next 5 years. So we'll be working closely on aligning our funding for our capital projects into the future. And given that the capital project fund relies on the general fund, which is currently experiencing some disruption, the delta between our needs and our estimated resources will likely grow wider and will need to be addressed. Doing that over the next year. Next slide. The other key piece here is we need to focus on the sustainability of our fund balance for the long term. So this chart is showing that we will deplete the balance in about 3 years if we apply the trends in the 5-year financial plan that we have. We use really basic assumptions for that plan, but even without a refined analysis, this is not a great trajectory and we have to align our priorities really soon. What will help is continuing to implement a structurally balanced budget that has occurred in the city for the last couple of years, where we have matched our recurring revenue sources with our recurring expenditures. So basically a balanced budget. And we've used the reappropriation amount really to make the transfers to the general fund. A truly balanced budget would also include the ongoing capital needs. So we've got a little work to do there. And our new finance director will have a good time with us as we move through that process. Next slide. And I think I'll stop there and just answer any questions that you have.
First off, I want to say thank you, Tanisha, and to our finance team for an excellent presentation. I feel like I feel much more in touch with what's going on. There were a lot of question marks, obviously, starting with the pandemic, and we had to make some assumptions last year. It looks like we weren't that far off from the assumptions we made during the last budget, which ended up sort of being last-minute amendments to a budget that had been in the works starting before the pandemic hit. But I thank you for the presentation. I want to open it up for questions from the council. Any questions, council members? Not seeing any. Lorianne, please. Lorianne and then Neil after her.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you to everyone involved in creating the presentation. I did have a question about the hotel. I know that reservations are down, revenues down, but I've seen in other jurisdictions that some of the hotels are being rented out by hospitals to accommodate either frontline workers or those who are socially distancing for particular reasons. And so I'm just wondering if the city has been approached to coordinate any efforts to rent out the hotels for those purposes to generate revenue opportunities.
So I'm not aware that we've been approached. We definitely, we work with the owners. And Tom is in touch with that group. He's on the hotel call, he and Sharon. We personally, as the city, are using the hotel because we have to house our snow team during snow events, because normally they would have been in pretty close quarters in public works, and that's really not a good thing to do during the pandemic. So we're actually contributing. I know the county has a contract as well, and other cities, everyone's sort of having to house their staff. We haven't really seen that translate into, really big numbers there. And I know in our case, they were very happy to work with us. So I don't think it's a normal room rate either that they're getting, and it's certainly nothing close to a regular season for them.
Thank you for that.
Neil, go ahead.
So first of all, I'd like to echo the mayor's thanks for a great presentation to you, Tanisha, and the finance staff and everybody who participated. I usually have a lot of questions, and really things were very clear. Even things that were unclear from reading the packet, you clarified completely. So my only question is this: at the start of when the pandemic first really started to become obviously real, we carved, I think, about $3 million out of the budget. Are you seeing that was helpful, and that was maybe to get us to the point where we're going to be okay, or are you seeing the need for further cuts? That's my first question. I'll have a follow-up as well.
So that's a great question, Neil. Thank you for that. I do think the 3 million carve out was extremely helpful. And I would say it has been a pleasure to work with this staff so far, because everybody is very conscious of spending. Where no one's asking for things that they don't absolutely need. And in those cases, there's really not much on that list. So that $3 million carve out was extremely helpful. We are still trending down from our revenue budget because of, at the time you all needed to adopt the budget, think about May and June. We hadn't even experienced the worst of it yet, right? And so I think it made good sense at that point in time, that snapshot in time, that we would have been thinking the second half of the fiscal year would look better. And so that's why you're seeing, the room rates and things like that having a significant impact and really causing some decline there. I think that we can manage within the expense budget, continue to manage that down to not, I would love to get to a place where we don't need to use the budgeted reappropriation. But in any year, certainly a year that we're impacted by the pandemic, that would be a year that I would say it's okay to lean a little bit on the reappropriation if we need to for operations. But we're going to do everything we can to try to keep the operations budget in line with the regular recurring revenue and only use the reappropriation if needed to make the transfers as was planned at the beginning of the year. We're really close. We're really close. I think we can get there. Janice, do you want to add anything? I know we were just having this conversation earlier.
I think you covered everything. I think, that it is trending that our expenses will be lower than we had initially budgeted, which will kind of keep us in line with the revenue being lower. So yeah, that's good.
And
Right.
you had a second question?
Yeah, my other question is related to the capital budget. So I think it's been clear for the last several years that we had some very high-priced capital projects coming up, and we were kind of getting ahead of ourselves in terms of having funds available, especially given the fact that we're a pay-as-you-go city. I think the current project of the police station, and then the new park that's going in, where the Consumer Product Safety Commission used to be, are both pretty pricey projects. What else do we see coming down the pike, and is there anything there that you're thinking, or that there's a general consensus that we can push out a few years without really impacting our city's desired plans?
So there are some major projects in that 5-year plan. None of them compare at all to what we're spending on the new building, obviously, or the park. But there's some larger projects in there, some bigger renovation projects. I want to, and what we're focused on, Dennis and I have had this discussion. I've talked with the Public Works Facilities team, and we really need to take a look at instituting a fix-it-first approach and making sure that we have identified resources set aside to maintain the assets that we have. So those things outside of the asset fund, right? So the asset fund will take care of our vehicles and our equipment. So we're really set there. But our buildings, our facility, the HVAC, the building envelope, all of those things need to be accounted for in a similar plan and a similar approach before we bring more new things online. So we'll really be focused on that and incorporating those kinds of pieces, life cycle costs into the plan, which is going to further create, you know, more divide between what we expect to be available and what we need to do. But we certainly don't want to not be able to maintain what we have now and build new things that we can't maintain in the future. So we've got to right size it.
All right, I think that's great. I think I've had many conversations with staff about exactly what you just described, because we discovered how to do that on a much smaller scale, obviously, at the Kentlands Homeowners Association, where we worked out an asset management plan with outside help from an engineering / accounting company to figure out what our long-term repair needs would be for the entire asset. So that made it possible to put money away in reserve so that you'd have it when you needed it. So I really applaud any efforts to go forward on that basis, because otherwise we would just potentially see the deterioration of some of the things that we count on. So that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. We'll go to Mike.
Okay, I'll echo the compliments already made to Tanisha and the finance team for a really informative report and assessment, and the projections. I think, so all things considered, I think, and compared to many other cities in the United States, comparable in our size in terms of operating costs and budget, we're in fantastic shape. I don't want to say that too often, but it's clear that we have that. I think the fact that we still have this requirement of a 25% reserve is probably twice what most cities have of any size. I think that requires some discipline to maintain that, and I think it's pretty clear in terms of the budget plans that you've shown us. About 13 years ago, even when we were facing declines in revenues and the entire United States was in a recession, or the recession had begun, it was clear that we're going to have a few years of it. I think that council made a decision and supported the idea that we would establish an economic development fund so that we would be primed to provide assistance and incentives for entities that began to grow and develop as we came out of the recession. And I think it's important that we keep that in mind. I think that was, a very novel and creative and innovative strategy. And I think it kind of put us on the map in terms of our commitment to economic development in the city. And I think hopefully we'll see that again in these plans and in the outlook and projecting what we might be able to do. I think we have to just be, we have to be positioned to be able to do that right away. And it's good to hear that we have some potential development in the short term, certainly some of it related to, I think, the change in technology and biotech and R&D. The city seems to have positioned itself well for that industry. So I think we're going to see continued development in that sector for quite a while. So we should benefit from that. But I think there's a lot of other ancillary businesses and economic development that's ancillary to that economic sector. So I hope that that we can take advantage of that. So those are kind of my comments. It's a pretty comprehensive outlook that you provided and overview of the budget. So I think we're still going to be able to rely on state and even federal funding. Hopefully the stimulus or the COVID relief bill is going to include funds for state and local governments. That will be direct rather than a pass-through from the state and from the county. So I think there might be some opportunities there in terms of addressing some of our infrastructure needs. So,
I agree with all that, Mike. I think, one, it's hard to believe it's already been 13 years since the recession.
right.
Um, and the cities that came out of that were able to make investments during that time, right? And so I think that's important, and we want to have an eye toward, where are there areas we should be looking to double down to position ourselves to take advantage when we come out of the pandemic. I'd say as the federal relief bill works its way through Congress, we don't want to say too loudly that we're doing fantastic, because it's we want to make sure we're able to receive some of that. And my understanding right now is designed to be a revenue replacement, and so that will be helpful. If it brings us whole, I think that puts us in even better position, better footing. So thank you for those comments. But I agree, and I think you'll hear more from Tom next week. With some of our ideas and strategies. We are looking at a small business strategy, something more robust than we've done in the past, because the neighborhood businesses are important as well, and biotech is doing well. We do need to continue the care and feeding there, but there are other sectors we need to look at as well. So you'll hear more about that.
I think it's important to remember that part of our investment 13 years ago was to create the economic development kind of division within this, within the city manager's office. So we have, and Tom is the legacy from that. So, and his team. So good investment. I think it's paid off.
I would agree with that. Thank you for that.
Okay, we'll go to Rob Wu.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Tanisha, and thank you to your folks for putting this comprehensive presentation together. I don't really have many questions, and that kind of speaks to the quality of the information presented. I just want to say I appreciate the kind of the snapshot that you're giving us, particularly leading into our planning retreat, because it really gets my head into the direction of the city and the budgetary impacts going forward. I just wanted to make one comment, and really it stems from the one graph that you put regarding the spending away of the spending down of the reserves. And so, back when I came on the council in 2015, we made a conscious decision that we could want to invest that money, but also we had reserves that were higher than most cities, and so we could use that capital in other ways. But it was a conscious decision that was really temporary in nature, that we wouldn't go, deficit spending for operations. And so that the chart that you showed, showing that if we continue as is, we're going to be going into the red, is kind of an awakening as to the decision that we made back then, and the ultimate legacy of that would be trying to flatten out revenue or flatten out costs so that we could ultimately have a sustainable budget. So it'll be interesting going forward to see on the long term what you and staff come up with and how to kind of flatten that curve so that we're not going to run into the red.
Yeah, and we look forward to you all working with us on that one. We're definitely, that one's, at some point it will become all hands on deck, because we're going to need to agree on our priorities, and we're going to have to shift some things. I can't tell you what those are today, but it's clear that we are going to have to change some things around, and when we're changing things or cutting things out or delaying, we need to have an approach we agree on to prioritize that. So that'll be part of the process, and I'm really actually looking forward to it. I think it's a good challenge and to have right now, for us to work through that, before we're on the other side of the line. And I think some cities may wait too late, but I think we're in a good place to redirect.
We'll go to Ryan.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll echo all of the compliments to the staff team for an excellent presentation and for absolutely having your head in the right place, all of you, in terms of not only the forest, but also the trees. In terms of the fund balance and looking at the projections of expenditures in the out years, obviously, we're going to have to, completely sort of re-examine our assumptions over the next, at least in the short term, over the next couple of years from prior budgets. But I did just want to clarify that the charts about examining the use of the fund balance and the sort of the shrinking unassigned fund balance over the coming years doesn't just reflect increased expenses. It also reflects anticipated decreased revenue as well, right?
I don't think it has decreased revenue in it. I can
Okay.
pull out. Nate, do you have it? I know that when we talked about this, the 5-year plan, as I said in my comments, it's not a sophisticated plan, right? It's using some basic assumptions. And
Right.
I can talk you through those really quickly, but they put it's on the revenue and the expense side, those assumptions.
So generally, the assumptions are that the local taxes are planned to increase 2% based on estimated property value appreciation. We're actually seeing growth outpacing that. Licenses and permits, federal and state grants are held flat. So the chart that is shown in the presentation is based on the 5-year plan that was in last year's budget book. So there will be an update to that this year. The licenses and permits, federal and state grants are held flat. County grants and shared taxes were increased by 2% based on expected income tax increases. So those would be related to new residents moving in. Page 180, Tanisha.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. And then charges for services are increased by 1%. Fines and forfeitures are shown decreasing 2% annually. And then miscellaneous revenue is shown increasing by 1% annually.
Thanks. Thanks, Nate. On the expenditure side, kind of following up on Rob's point, is what are the assumptions that we're going to be using to base the idea of potentially significant increases in expenses year over year going forward, which we've seen in previous estimates of the use of the fund balance and other estimates in our previous budgets.
So a few of the pieces that are really instrumental to the increases, there's kind of a planned 11% increase in healthcare costs year over year throughout the 5-year plan. What we've seen in the past 3 years is that healthcare costs have held steady. During the pandemic, we've seen much lower costs for the healthcare, just because a lot of people aren't actually going out and using it. So there is potential there for those costs to increase in the next year. But the meeting with Legit doesn't occur until I think March or April. We plan for 5% increases in personnel costs. Generally, we haven't seen those in the last year, with the vacancies, planned vacancies, furloughs and everything like that. I could see a decrease in the personnel costs from FY20 to FY21. And
So,
then, go ahead.
I was just gonna say what that does, Ryan, is it buys us a little time, right? So as I was saying, when we look at those basic assumptions and we fly that out over the 5 years, they are basic assumptions. They can be refined, but once you get out past a year or two in a forecast, you really don't know what you're working with, right? So even using those basic assumptions, it looks like we've run out in 3 years. I'd say we're somewhere in the 3 to 5 year, 3 to 6 year range of when we run into trouble if we don't do anything about it. If we drill down on those costs. So I think that the assumptions that go into that 5-year plan make sense for how we need to approach our budgeting. But when we start to break down those numbers to really try to realign the CIP and some of our future needs, that we'll be able to refine that a little better and have a better short-term picture that informs the longer-term picture, if that makes sense.
Great, I appreciate that, and I understand that it is very difficult, to anticipate what's going to happen 3, 4, 5 years from now. I mean, just imagine where we were 2, 3 years ago from now. No one would have anticipated this.
Everyone's trend
but
would be upside down now, right? Because there's going to be this pandemic in the middle of everyone's trend going forward.
Right. But, just to make the point, and I don't want to belabor the point, but just to make the point that those of us who've been on the council for a while now have sort of often joked in previous years that, sometimes it sort of looks like we're falling off a cliff at the end of our 5-year future projection. And it turns out we come to that point in reality and we're actually okay. And I know that's just sort of a fundamental sort of imperfection in the game of trying to make these estimates so many years out into the distance. But obviously it's not a sustainable plan for us to have a 5-year estimate that suggests that we're going to suddenly not have any money left 5 years from now. But that has never been the case when the 5-year mark comes along. So I don't know how to fix that. I don't know if there really is a way to fix it, or just to acknowledge that it's sort of an issue with the long-term projection process.
I do think you've made the city, obviously prior to my arrival, you've made some really good strides, and that the staff set a goal around budget variance.
Right.
So I can see the scenario that you've explained playing out in prior years. There's actually a slide, but you will see it in the probably in the budget workshop in April, because there was a goal set around the variance, right? Are we under projecting revenue so severely that we're impacting service delivery? Are we over projecting expenses that have the same impact? To come in within 0.4% for last year, right? And in the last couple of years, I think it's been 2 or 3% of budget, versus 10 years ago, where you were probably at 10%. There were these huge variances between the budgeted amounts. So I do think there's been a lot of refinement there. And so I have more confidence in those numbers. There is going to be a bit of conservatism involved, of course, but I do think, by taking a look at how far are we off from budget, and measuring that as a factor of what's real and what's not in that 5-year plan, I think that has closed that gap a bit. And then obviously these pandemic declines are real, right? We've obviously experienced those, and I would say for your past few years, you've been okay, but you've also spent reappropriation to be okay. So that's not the same as being okay and adding, thinking we're going to spend, like we did in 20, we're going to spend $2 million of the balance. We actually end up providing $2 million to the fund balance. That hasn't happened regularly in the past few years. So the being okay part has involved some reappropriation, and that's what we need to examine.
No, good points. And I do acknowledge, especially one of the last things Tony really focused on before he left was trying to close that gap in accurate budgeting of expenses and revenues. And we are starting to see that. Certainly your reference to the closeness of the one in the presentation tonight at the 0.04% is a great example of that. The only other question I had was, just wanted to follow up on the stormwater fund section of the presentation, and just kind of clarify that the annual general fund transfer that had been going on of 1.2 million has now dropped, I think you said, to 170,000, but that's anticipated to be basically a long-term drop, that we're reducing transfers by an amount of $1 million basically this year and then going forward. And I know we're still waiting for the rate model presentation and discussion, but that we anticipate that we will no longer have to transfer $1 million every year from the general fund to the stormwater fund. And so that's $1 million additional dollars that we'll have in the general fund each year.
Yes, good point. And yes, so thanks for emphasizing that. That will continue. I think you all looked at it as a budget maneuver for this current fiscal year. But once we got into the rate model, we believe it'll be clear that we don't need to reestablish that subsidy. There are some other short-term options we have. We talked a little bit about housing fund. And I think, we could stand to skip a transfer if push came to shove for this next fiscal year to kind of close the projected gap there. So we have some options ahead of us that, don't involve significant disruption to staff or to service or any of those things. We have some good options available, but the 1 million will help going forward.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other hands up. So I will thank Janice and Nate for being with us, and
Thank
we
you,
will
guys.
move on to our next agenda item, which is public comments. And tech team, if you wouldn't mind playing the instructional video for people who want to make public comments, that would be great. Tech team,
Working on it. Got it.
okay.
Good evening. If you've connected to the meeting tonight via Zoom and you're on a desktop or a laptop and you wish to make a public comment, we can't currently see or hear you. What you need to do, please, is wiggle your mouse around and look towards the bottom center of your screen. You should see a raise hand button. Go ahead and click on that now for us, please. Alternatively, if you've connected in via telephone, you can press *9.
Okay. Thank you, tech team. So as per usual, we ask that you state your name and address or neighborhood for the record. Keep your comments to no more than 3 minutes. If you have more than 3 minutes worth of stuff to tell us, we're glad to receive it via email. We'll consider it just like oral testimony. And I will tech team, if you could bring up Lynn Nash, please. And Lynn, when you come up, just unmute yourself, state your name, address or neighborhood, and go right ahead.
Unmute. Do you got me?
Yeah, go right ahead, Lynn.
Great. My name is Lynn Nash and I live in Saybrook. I'm concerned that the later discussion in 10D about a proposed zoning change is an attempt to circumvent the voice concerns of the people who live in Gaithersburg and pay taxes. There should be absolutely no way that the zoning ordinances are changed to put an industrial use in any homeowner's backyard in Gaithersburg. That includes the proposed crematorium use in CD zone. I hope what this is instead is an attempt to tighten the zoning rules to prohibit such potential use in the future, removing the by right clause available to an existing establishment. As homeowners, many of us have told you that if the city wants industrial use areas to increase city revenues, and we know that's important, to include a crematorium, that you need to find a place for them, like in Air Park or Lake Forest Mall, not in someone's backyard. I'm unhappy. I bought a house in a neighborhood that screamed hometown USA. I bought in a city where we have a Labor Day parade with every scout and high school band marching proudly. I did this after looking at 42 homes in a day and a half. I kept being drawn back by the atmosphere of Old Town and the surrounding neighborhoods. That wasn't that long ago, but things sure have changed. Now you are bookending my neighborhood and taking a portion of Kelly Park for another school in return for 1.5 million in perks. And we homeowners in the 5 surrounding neighborhoods still don't know if even a new school is needed, given the admitted student decline, or if our kids will be allowed to attend either, air quotes, neighborhood school. You are allowing a gas station in the backyard of folks who live in a well-established neighborhood, and you are yet considering another car wash, which we really don't need. Let me be clear. I don't want the zoning rules changed unless it's intentionally to tighten the existing codes to prevent a crematorium and other like industrial uses adjacent to established neighborhoods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Before we go on, I see one other person from the public who wants to speak, and I will call on you in a second, Shanika. But I do want to clarify that the zoning text amendment introduction later in this meeting is an attempt to tighten up the zoning language to make sure that if somebody would like to put in a crematorium, they would have to get permission from the council and go through a public process rather than do it by right. So that is the intent there, or that is the effect, I should say. So with that, I will call tech team, if you can bring up Shanika Whitehurst, please. And Shanika, just go ahead and state your name, address, or neighborhood and go right ahead.
Good evening, council. My name is Shanika Whitehurst. I live in Deer Park in Gaithersburg. And I come to you today. I'm mainly concerned if we take a step back to January 8th and the unfortunate loss of life that occurred on the city streets. That is disturbing to me, as I stated before. I think the nature of Mr. O'Con's death, even though I'm not a proponent of bad behavior by no means, but I am a proponent of keeping life if necessary. I think there's many ways, and I'm seeing many ways of someone that could be disarmed without killing them. And I think that the silence, I guess, that I've heard from the council is just unbecoming. It's unbecoming of the city and the character that I thought would have been shown. There is a great concern amongst a good portion of your citizenry with this, with street clothes, just officers in street clothes, no cameras. I understand that it is being investigated by a local jurisdiction, also with Montgomery County Police. But, you know, what is your plan? Are you going to have a meeting with the people? Are you going to hear concerns? Are we going to have a true and factual discussion about what happened or what occurred after all the results come in? Just the silence on the issue is saddening, really. And you would think that after the events that we saw and the unfortunate death of George Floyd over the summer and the protests that sprung up thereafter, that, you know, we wouldn't be having this conversation now going into, you know, year 1.2 of this pandemic and people still getting shot down. So that's my my real concern. And then second, I was happy to see the amendments come up for the crematory language, and look forward to that discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shanika. You know, I'm sure we will have statements to make and a discussion about it when we get results from the investigation of the incident that happened on January 8th. We are keenly interested in it, and we're not interested in being silent about it either, but we want to make sure that when we're speaking about it, we're speaking from a factual basis, and that's how we're proceeding, and we're waiting patiently, but we're eagerly awaiting the results of that investigation, as you are. Tech team, if you could bring up Prentice Searles, please, that would be great. And Prentice, just unmute yourself, state your name, address, or neighborhood, and go right ahead.
Yes, my name is Prentice Searles. I am at 10 Walker Avenue in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and have been here for about 20 years. If this is not the best time to talk about the ordinance, then I'm happy to wait. Do you have some direction for me there?
When you say the ordinance,
The ordinance regarding the crematorium and the redefinition of funeral homes.
Yes, this is the best time. Go right ahead, Prentice.
Great. So I sent, per the request online, several questions. And I think that you may have those. It's unclear how that process works. But my concern is similar to the first speakers and I think the second speakers also, which is it appears that what the city is doing is the right thing, which is tightening up the language so that we have some clarity, both for the community that lives there as well as the funeral home owners that live or that are doing business in the city. And it also appears that what this does is to improve that language such that it clarifies you can't put a crematorium in an existing funeral home that is adjacent to existing residences. There's lots of changes that are made, and not having time to go through all of the code nor necessarily understanding it, I would ask that there be some clarification of the terms of abuts, confronts, and adjacent, because I could look at the Duval funeral home and think that it may not abut, confront, or be adjacent to a residence. So it was unclear how that new approach would be managed or how it would impact them, and the decision that was made last year in August. Also the question regarding, how many funeral homes are currently located in Gaithersburg, and what is their planning zone? Are they CD, CBD, MXD, et cetera, et cetera? So it would be really interesting to have a map that identified where they are and what zone they are in, so we could understand how the ordinance is applied to those exact current locations. And would you be allowed to put a crematorium in an existing building at a current funeral home or in a new building that's at a current funeral home? And then finally, just trying to understand paragraph 24-102, paragraph C. So that's the questions I've got.
Okay, Prentice, I want to thank you for putting this all out there. I'm glad you put this in writing. I just want to clarify to you and to anybody else here. Tonight is going to be an introduction of this text amendment. Okay, and so if it does get introduced tonight, we're going to have a public hearing on this on March 15th. We're not voting on this tonight, so I just want to make sure everybody understands that. Prentice, you will have time, certainly have time to get this. We'll stick your questions if you did email them. I don't recall getting an email from you yet, but it just may not have come through yet. But anything you say or ask about this will be added to the record, and then we will have our public hearing if it's introduced tonight on March 15th. Okay. Tech team, if you could bring up Patrick Casey, please. Patrick, same deal. Just state your name, unmute yourself, state your name and address or neighborhood, and go right ahead.
Yes, hi, Mr. Mayor and City Council. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address the issues regarding the zoning for the crematorium, especially. I'm a little concerned. We went through this crematorium aggravation earlier, and I think it became pretty clear. No one in at least the Deer Park area where the crematorium is going to be located felt that it was an appropriate use to have that industrial use in adjacent to, in fact, actually in a residential dwelling. So I just want to express my concern and opinion that although I greatly applaud your efforts to constrict or reduce or contain that zoning, that permission for the crematorium to be permitted in the CD zone, I still think, if I may say, that I believe it's still an inappropriate use under any circumstances in that CD zone, which is a buffer zone that abuts about 90% residential properties. So I think that rather than reduce it under some sort of special circumstance, that it would be more appropriate to eliminate its potential in a CD zone in its entirety. So I think we would like to see the United Gaithersburg, East Gaithersburg United would like to see that permission potential for even under special circumstances or special exception, or however you'd like to couch it, should be removed in its entirety from the CD zone so that it would never be allowed. And the citizens and residents of those areas adjacent to the CD zone would not be tortured by having to object to it in the future. So I greatly appreciate your efforts on that behalf. And I would just like to express my opinion that I would like to see those efforts go a little bit further than we now see in your proposal. So thanks for the time, and thanks for listening. Take care.
Okay, thank you. And as I said earlier, if we do introduce this tonight, you'll have another chance at the public hearing, and we'll open up a record, and there'll be a chance for everyone to put in their questions and comments. Any other testimonies tonight from the public? Going once, going twice. Okay, we're going to move on then. Thank you very much. We're going to go to from the mayor and city council, and we're going to start with council member Neil Harris.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks to all the public members of the public who are attending, and those of you who let us know what you're thinking. It's always important for us to hear from you. So I'm going to keep it relatively brief. Some interesting things that happened in recent times is that you probably heard there was a bit of an accident, as we're told, at the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They have a small reactor there, and there was a little bit of an accident, as we're told, where there was some radioactivity that was released. That was contained within the building that contaminated several workers, and they've been decontaminated and are fine. Many of us attended a special briefing for city officials and staff, as well as a community event that was open to the public. We've been reassured. We're looking at the situation, but it seems that this was a one-time event. We're told it's the first time and only time that something like this has happened at that small reactor at NIST. And we're keeping an eye to make sure that this is something that is going to remain safe. Somebody asked during the course of the news coming out of the event why I was allowed to build a reactor so close to residential areas, but of course that reactor was there before there were residential areas. So at any rate, it's a concerning situation, appears to be under control, but we're keeping an eye on it to make sure that that's really the case. A number of holidays and other events that I'd like to touch on. One is the Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year. I guess all my friends from that part of the world want to wish you a Happy New Year, and hopefully a better New Year than the last year we had, which was not such a great one. Attended a couple of events, one that was called From Foundations to Frontiers, Chinese American Contributions to the Fabric of America. Very interesting presentation on the history of Chinese people coming to this country, working and contributing to our country in many ways. And then of course the annual Lunar New Year celebration that was held online this year instead of at Lake Forest Mall, but it was still very entertaining, by the Chinese Cultural Society, the CCACC. Several other holidays this month. Hopefully everybody had a day off and enjoyed President's Day. I had a great Valentine's Day. And I have to say that I'm annoyed with the groundhog this year. Saw his shadow giving us 8 more weeks of winter, which seems to have really taken winter up a notch. I tried for a recount, asking for a recount. I don't know how it is that we allow our winter weather to be controlled by a Pennsylvania-based rodent, but it is what it is. So anyway, I'll go to one last more serious note, which is the COVID vaccine is I've talked to a number of residents who have looked for whatever assistance they can get to work through the system to get themselves vaccinated. I know it's been frustrating, but it seems that things are getting better slowly but surely. I know my wife had her second dose of vaccine. I would say, based on experience, that if you're signed up for the second dose of vaccine, plan on not doing much the next day because it does take its toll. But the 2 days later, she was doing much better and is back up and about after her shot on Friday. And but anyway, you know, it's important for us to get that herd immunity together, and the more people that get vaccinated, the better off we are. So strongly urge you to be persistent. There are a number of places that you can sign up to get an appointment, from the county site to various healthcare organizations. I know Johns Hopkins has been providing vaccines, although not so much locally. But you can sign up and drive somewhere and get them in Columbia or in their facility in Baltimore. Hospitals, you know, the recommendation is sign up on every list that you can get on and get your vaccine as soon as you can get it. That's all for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. We'll go to Mike.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Neil. I'll echo much of what you said. Some really good celebrations. I want to wish everybody a happy Lunar New Year. It's the year of the ox. Also want to mention those of you who observe Mardi Gras. Well, that's tonight. It's Fat Tuesday, Mardi Gras, Shrove Tuesday. Tomorrow is the first day of Lent. So, and Ash Wednesday for those who observe that as well. So get your fill in today and figure out what you're going to do for the rest of Lent. I will comment on the weather. I agree. I'm not happy with the groundhog either, but considering the temperatures in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and even Kentucky, where my daughter lives now, in Lexington, where it was 5 degrees today, I don't have much of a problem with our current climate, but I guess we ought to get ready. We already have a winter storm warning for tomorrow, so I guess we can expect some more weather before the weekend. I also attended the meeting with the NIST officials, and I guess one of the things that they did, we did urge them, and they seem to have adopted the policy, is that they need to communicate much better with the surrounding communities, not only about their regular operations, but also about how to communicate when something like this does occur. This was a first-time event in the 50 years of the reactor being there. I think that's important to know. Of course, a nuclear reactor is one that you don't want any kind of event at, but it will not be going back into operation until they figure out what really happened, and we expect that to be communicated directly to the public and probably also through the city as well. I did attend on February 4th, the 18th Annual Young Artist Award performances. That's usually held at the Kentlands Mansion. I'm sorry, at the Kentlands Art Barn. This year it was held virtually. The performances were virtual and pre-recorded. They were wonderful as always. The young people aged 12 to 18 exhibiting a great amount of talent. So the competition ran as it usually does. This year there was a new award dedicated in the memory of former Kentlands Community Foundation Executive Director Carrie Dietz, who passed suddenly this and unexpectedly in the last year. There were a significant number of donations made and contributions made in her memory. And one of the things that the family decided to do was to dedicate an award in her name to be given for the next few years to the highest scoring performance artist from the city of Gaithersburg, a resident from the city of Gaithersburg. So that was the first award given this year. Carrie spent a lot of time when she was executive director working with and promoting that event. And so I think it was a very nice tribute to her. And that's really about all I have. Happy Mardi Gras, and Take care of yourself. Remember, we're still in a pandemic. That doesn't, just because there are vaccines doesn't mean you can stop being safe. So wear a mask. If you go out, avoid crowds, especially indoors. Wash your hands regularly and maintain your social distance when you do see people, whether you're wearing a mask or not, but you should be wearing a mask. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. We'll go to Ryan.
Thanks, Mayor. I echo and associate myself with the comments of my colleagues on all of the well wishes for events and celebrations and cautions regarding public safety. The only thing I want to add tonight is that at the suggestion of one of my law partners who co-chairs the Montgomery County Bar Association's Racial Justice Council, today I emailed with Tanisha and the mayor and some staff and suggested that we may want to research the history of the lynching case of Sidney Randolph in the 1800s. I believe Sidney Randolph was one of 3 lynching victims identified in Montgomery County through recent research and historical analysis, and then consider whether it might be appropriate for the city of Gaithersburg to pursue some sort of recognition or historical marker of those events, given the Randolph case has some connection to the city of Gaithersburg. It was related to a break-in and an attack on a family that lived in Old Town Gaithersburg, and then that attack was later blamed on Sidney Randolph, apparently without much evidence, and that led to ultimately the extrajudicial lynching of Sidney Randolph, which happened, the lynching itself happened in Rockville. And the county is undertaking plans now to commemorate the 3 lynchings that took place in the county with some planned events for September of 2021. And so I thought it might make sense for us to look into whether or not the city would want to somehow participate in those commemorations and connect it somehow to the history of the Sidney Randolph case. So I'm just putting that out there for further discussion. We have some time before September, but I thought it might be an important discussion for us to have in commemorating unfortunate history, but important things for us to be learning about and teaching about in these times. That's all I've got this evening.
Thanks, Ryan. And I thought you made a good decision to reach out to the community museum team to see what they could come up with on it, and we can take a look and see what they turn up. We'll go to Councilmember Wu.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I don't have much to add. I appreciate the dizzying array of topics, from nuclear meltdowns to weather prognosticating rodents. But yeah, happy New Year to everyone. One other holiday this week. Everyone knows Valentine's Day was on Sunday. That means for the foreseeable future, it's half off candy day at most retail establishments. So everyone partake.
All right, we'll go to Councilmember Sales.
Thank you, Mayor. So I too will echo some of the comments that have been shared. Happy New Year. I too attended the Young Artist Award and was able to present the first Carrie Dietz Award for Excellence. Carrie was an integral part of the Young Artist Award for many years in her capacity as Executive Director of the Kentlands Community Foundation. So congratulations to all of our participants. Last week, I joined Tanisha for a meeting with a representative from SoulSmart to explore some sustainable energy options. They are a partner with the National League of Cities and ICMA. SoulSmart promotes best practices modeled by local governments, and they implement a public-private partnership approach to install solar panels in municipalities. we found out that they already have two pilot programs in Montgomery County. One is already in the city of Gaithersburg at the police headquarters on Darnestown. So this service is provided at no cost to us, and SoulSmart provides rating designations ranging from bronze, silver, and gold, and similar to some of the other organizations that provide technical assistance and designations that we are already a part of. So hopefully we will hear more about those opportunities. Last week, I also met with Congressman Anthony Brown's staff with the National League of Cities to talk about his new legislation, the Safe Routes to School legislation, which would expand the current Safe Routes to School bill. And this bill is basically going to provide funding to have complete streets. This was in response to an uptick in pedestrian related accidents and Vision Zero initiative. So hopefully we'll get some movement on there, and we should be following up with the rest of our federal delegation members next month at the Congressional Cities Conference when National League of Cities reconvenes for their lobby day on the Hill. And so I did have some other information to bring up. So as one of the most diverse cities in the country, our advocacy on certain legislation, particularly legislation concerning the school resource officers, is troubling to say the least, that we are taking the time to weigh in on a potentially harmful legislation that data has shown supports the overcriminalization of students of color. Further, as a Black woman, the mother of an MCPS graduate, I'm concerned that we are discussing public safety issues at the county level and have yet to make progress towards reimagining policing in our diverse city. While the SRO program on the surface seems like a great initiative, the county's racial equity, inclusion, and justice statement say otherwise. Based on the data compiled by the county's Office of Legislative Oversight, there's a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown students who make up only 20% of the population, but account for over 50% of the arrests in MCPS schools. Nationally, the overrepresentation of Black children among students suspended, expelled, and arrested in schools is a key feature of the school to prison pipeline. Similarly, Black students are overrepresented among school-based arrests in Montgomery County. As noted, while Black students account for 22% of the MCPS enrollment, among students arrested in schools between 2015 and 2019, Black students accounted for 47% of all arrests in MCPS schools. Boys and students eligible for special education services were also overrepresented among arrested students, suggesting that Black boys with disabilities were the subgroup at highest risk of arrests within MCPS. Instead of supporting therapeutic interventions that would ensure unarmed public safety professionals could be staffing our schools, who are more inclined to handle behavioral issues and challenges in our schools more thoughtfully and therapeutically. It's my strong opinion that we take no position with the SRO bills that are being introduced at the county level. Since there are various bills concerning this issue being introduced locally and at the state, we should let it play out in the legislative process. We have our own public safety concerns here in the city of Gaithersburg with the ongoing investigation of the incident involving our street crimes unit and the recent murder of a Black resident. How are we ranking our priorities? If we had a racial equity resolution here in the city of Gaithersburg, as many other municipalities around the county and around the state have implemented after the incident involving George Floyd, we may have a better framework to review legislation rather than relying on anecdotal information. We may be better equipped to make such data-driven decisions. I propose further study on this issue since many questions remain about the data that was shared, and maybe even considering creating our own Office of Policy Analysis as we consider legislation or any decisions that we make. If our city manager thinks it's an important issue to implement a racial equity policy internally, why are we complacent with shortchanging our residents? What are we afraid of? What are we waiting for? Thank you.
Thanks, Lorianne. I respect where you're coming from. I appreciate the statement. Let me just offer a little bit of background for anybody who's viewing this and doesn't know where this all is coming from. There is Craig Rice and Sidney Katz, county council members, have introduced a bill that sort of competes with. There was a bill initially introduced by County Council Member Will Juando and Hans Reamer, which would eliminate the school resource officer program. And there's a counter bill that's been introduced by Councilmember Katz and Rice that would keep the school resource officer program, but just require enhanced training. I suggested to the council that I go and testify on behalf of the city in favor of the Katz-Rice bill that would preserve the school resource officers and just require enhanced training. My initial reasons for doing it, as I expressed in an email to the council, were one, this program has been extremely valuable. It does impact us directly because we do have one of our the program is in our community, and one of our police officers is a participant, is a SRO over at Gaithersburg High School. That program has been outstandingly successful over the years, and has added to our community, and I believe has helped build trust and build bridges within the community, and the most diverse high school in the most diverse city, and one of the top two most diverse cities in the country. Secondly, all the principals of all the high schools signed on to a letter saying that this program, they wanted to continue the program. Lorianne did show me send me the link to the Office of Legislative Oversight's Racial Equity and Social Justice Impact Statement, which basically says, I'll push back on a couple of things there that I think are deficient in their analysis of this. One is that they say that if they would recommend that we eliminate the SRO program if the money that's allocated to fund that program is reallocated toward mental health and social emotional learning. But there's a couple of problems with that suggestion. First off, the county council doesn't have direct control over what MCPS does with that money. So we're talking about MCPS wanting to have more mental health, more counselors support. And the way it would work is MCPS would put that into their budget, and either the county council would fund that or they wouldn't. And if they didn't, then MCPS could still they can still find some money in that budget to fund counselors, or make it a big political issue. But either way, even if it's not, it's kind of a false choice that the county can make a decision between SROs and how MCPS would implement mental health. The other problem with that is that even if we so let's say we do eliminate SROs at the schools, Either way, the police will still have to respond to calls from the schools. And the statistics are there are 269 arrests. And just to drill down on that a little bit further, in the last full school year, there was 269 arrests. 27 of them were physical arrests where a student had to be taken down and booked somewhere. The other 242 were paper arrests, which means it's essentially a referral to the Department of Juvenile Services. But of the 269, 260 were not initiated by SROs. They were initiated by MCPS staff. And you know, maybe there is a problem with disproportionality, unequal treatment. That's possible, but it doesn't suggest that the problem is originating with the SROs if the SROs aren't initiating these arrests. It says there could be a problem with MCPS staff, and perhaps there could be more of a need for sensitivity training within MCPS. But either way, if 97% of the arrests are initiated by a report from MCPS staff, and there's not and we eliminate the SROs, so presumably they just make the report, the police show up, and what we get now is, instead of somebody who is trained, who has spent the time building trust and building bridges in the community, we have an officer show up who's probably not specifically trained, probably not used to dealing with kids, probably doesn't have that trust in the community. And I say to myself, well, how could that be better than somebody who is trained for it? It just doesn't make sense to me that that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg I have in terms of problems with the racial equity and social justice impact statement from OLO. I'm not sure. As I read it and sort of with a fine tooth comb, I said to myself, I can't believe that we actually, with our tax dollars, we're paying county staff to put this is an advocacy statement. It's not, there wasn't anything from the side of evaluating what initiated those arrests and the justification of those arrests, like the validity of them. I thought the logic was deficient. And so I appreciate the statement. I join you in wanting to find legislative and policy means to be fair and equitable to everybody. But in this case, I think that SROs are not the problem. SROs are actually a very good thing. And when we look at Gaithersburg High School in the specific, Bobby Blackman hasn't made any type of arrest in the last 7 years. In fact, there's nothing but real, almost like beautiful, heart-wrenching success stories with the lives he's been able to touch and the people he's been able to mentor, and the bridges he's been able to build have helped us in our community. In fact, after George Floyd, when the protests started to happen in this community, one of the lead players from our police force was Bobby Blackman, and that's no accident. Bobby had built these relationships. He knew some of the organizers, he knew some of the kids who were going to be involved, and he was a great help in helping turn what was a very tense situation into a positive. So I just see, in terms of our community, from what we've seen and from what every principal for every high school in Montgomery County has seen, this is a good program. And so that's why I suggested to the council that we testify in favor of preserving it. And, if there's going to be more training, that could only enhance it. And I'll open it up if anybody wants to opine about whether we should testify or not. Just raise your hand. We'll go with Rob Wu first.
I'll just comment briefly, and I thank you both for bringing up the subject and the information you've provided and the heartfelt sentiments that you've shared. And for me, when we were discussing which legislation to support, it the way that it played out in my mind was that we have a long held tradition here in Gaithersburg not to stick our noses in other people's business. But the fact of the matter is that this particular county bill impacts our business, as the mayor just articulated. And so my experience here is with what I see and hear regarding what's going on at Gaithersburg High School, and really, as Judd articulated, is how community-based policing and engagement should be, as well as other experiences I've had with SROs in different situations. And so, of the legislation that is being proposed, one would take away this valuable community resource, and the other would enhance it. So that was my thought process in when Judd raised the issue of agreeing that we should support the Katz Rice counter proposal, I guess is the way it is. But Lorianne, I do appreciate the information that you sent. I do appreciate your thoughts. Obviously none of us would support any kind of situation where there is implicit or explicit bias being injected into the system. We need to confront that. But on this issue, it's a hyper-local issue where I think we do have skin in the game, and we're trying to preserve something that is working within the city.
Anybody else want to weigh in? Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, Rob has articulated well the same position I have. I would say that we actually do testify quite often with MCPS and the county council on school funding issues, whether it's the capital improvement plan or whether it's the operating budget, especially for those schools that serve our community and the children that live in Gaithersburg. So in a way, I don't see this as that distinct from the other types of testimony. I guess my concern with the Jawando Reamer measure is that it completely eliminates the SRO program where, and I'm not entirely convinced. I didn't find the OLO report particularly convincing in terms of data. There's no data on individual schools. There's no data on which would be important to tell us whether there's a problem at certain schools or whether it's across the board. I think the other thing I want to caution us about is I think, we've heard, the SRO who works from Gaithersburg, who works at Gaithersburg High School is Bobby Blackman. He's well known to the community, but I think it's dangerous as well to invest all of our aspirations and desires about a program, to invest that all in a single individual, but hope that whatever individual from our police department is assigned to that position behaves in the same way and conducts themselves in the same way and professional manner and commitment to the safety of the children, the young people who attend that school, and to the safety of the staff, and contribute in the same way that Officer Blackman has. I think he would be a model in terms of the type of behavior the city and the county would want to see in any SRO. But like I said, I think it's important that we not make our choice based on the particular behavior of an individual. We have to talk about the program in general. So as it is, I didn't find the OLO report to have the data that I needed to make the judgment. On the other hand, I don't think that the measure to completely eliminate the program is a good or thoughtful measure as well, without disparaging the commitment and ideas of our friends on the county council. So certainly we should urge the county council to do a little bit better research on this particular issue, but I think we're going to have to wait also for the Board of Education to make some decisions about the position of SROs in county high schools and MCPS. So that's it. Thank you.
Lorianne.
Thank you for all of the comments that were shared. And so usually when we decide to weigh in on legislation outside of our jurisdiction, we are usually briefed by our legislative analysts or our attorneys to really analyze the legislation. And it wasn't just Will Jawando and Sidney Katz's bill, there was also a third option. And so if we haven't been briefed on the third option that was introduced by Nancy Navarro, I don't understand how we can arrive at this final support. And her bill is not asking for the removal of SROs, it's asking for reimagining the program and what the SRO program is going to be about. So I'm not advocating for the removal of any particular officer. I'm just asking us to ensure we are fully briefed on all the information provided at the county level for anything that's going to be introduced regarding this legislation. With all of the competing information that's been provided, I don't think we have enough information, and I don't think anyone has seen Councilmember Navarro's memo about the third option. So
No, I don't think the third option existed until Friday, maybe. You mentioned it this morning and I still haven't seen it. I would love to see Councilmember Navarro's option as well. But I can say that unequivocally, I am not in favor of supporting a bill that completely eliminates the program.
And I'm not
I don't have a problem stating that position.
I'm not asking us to support either bill. I'm asking us to get the full evidence of all three options and then make a decision. I just don't want us to get into the habit of making a decision without all of the options available to us. So that's what I'm trying to say.
Like I said, until this morning, there were only two options available to us. So
yeah,
that's where we are.
Lorianne, feel free to send whatever other option is out there that you'd like us to consider. So Ryan and Neil, did you want to weigh in or do you want to leave it at that? Okay. I'm not seeing anybody eager to weigh in. Ryan, you want just unmuted yourself.
I'll just say that, Lorianne and I have had a conversation and, I also respect the fact that she has raised this issue. And personally, I have no trouble acknowledging the data that demonstrates a major disproportionate impact on students of color when it comes to both policing and school discipline. And I believe that the school to prison pipeline is a real and very concerning phenomenon, which does need to be addressed. But what the data from OLO and other sources does not tell us is whether there's really any causality between those impacts and the presence of SROs in the schools of our community here in Gaithersburg. And yes, of course, we need to be investing in more school counselors and mental health workers. But like my other colleagues here, I am concerned about both calling for the dissolution of the SRO program altogether, or not supporting an improved SRO program that's been proposed. And I understand Councilmember Sales is also suggesting there's a third option here of simply not weighing in at all on any of the proposals being considered by the county. But my concern with that is that the county has given us, for better or worse, only until March 4th to present public comment. And I don't think we should remain silent on this important issue, which I do think directly affects the city of Gaithersburg. And I'm just not ready to say that we ought to scrap or oppose the program. And I'm waiting to see what the Board of Education is going to say, because as a key stakeholder here, we need their input. At this time, because I support improvements to training and to operational protocols for the program, I'm generally in support of the Rice-Katz approach, which has other co-sponsors as well, as was mentioned. And the bill does provide for improvements to training and to other operational protocols and updates to try to improve the program. But I also think we need further study to see what, if any, link exists between the presence of SROs in our community schools and the impacts, both positive and negative. But at this point, I'm supportive of the mayor offering testimony from the city in support of what we're calling the Rice Cats approach at this time.
All right. So we will take a look and see what Nancy Navarro has proposed and weigh it against the bill that we're aligned with at the moment. So thank you, Lorianne. And then I wanted to get back. So Lorianne, did you have any more comments from the mayor and council, or were you done?
No, I was done. I'm just wondering how we're going to weigh these three options. Are we going to do this publicly? Are we giving it to our legislative director, or are we making these decisions unilaterally?
Well, is there a decision that's been made thus far unilaterally that you're referring to?
Well, I'm just not sure. I wasn't sure where you were going. If you're going to go forward with it.
As of now, I'm anticipating that we're going forward with it because we have the majority of the council that's in favor of that. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, look, I would support learning more about the measure proposed by Councilmember Navarro. I think, I think the majority is pretty clear about the one proposal that completely eliminates the SRO program. I think the one we've seen, the Cats Rice bill, is one that we've seen. I think we've looked at the enhancements to the program as well as the maintenance of the existing SRO effort, and then ways to improve it. We need to look at the other one, and if I suppose the statement in testimony from the city would be to
here's the thing,
to work on those two.
Here's the thing, Mike, we have another meeting before the public hearing,
right?
So between this meeting and that meeting, we can get the text of this.
That's what I've suggested, is that we get the text of the third option, and figure out where we want to weigh in on that. All I'm saying is I think that the consensus, the majority already feel that eliminating the program is not a good idea, and it's not in the best interest of the city. We can talk about all the other things that we feel need to be done, and the elements and aspects of our society and culture that we need to address at a city level, at a school level, and at a county level. But I think that the majority are the majority already oppose elimination of the SRO program.
Okay, we'll go to Rob.
Or just a quick point to piggyback on what Mike said. We all, I think, recognize how the county council works, and it's pretty collaboratively. And so, when bills are filed, they could morph, they could be amended. And so, I take what Lorianne is saying is that, perhaps, Mr. Mayor, if we're on consensus, we ask Tanisha to have her staff update us as we go forward, and if we do have this meeting going forward, come up with some recommendations as to, particularly so we know what's going on. I mean, if these things are being filed on Friday and coming, to our attention in pretty close proximity to our meetings, we need to know what's going on so they can weigh it. But I do, support the concept of the Cats Rice bill.
Okay, and Tanisha, you feel guided here?
Yes, I do. I was going to mention that we've already reached out to Jess and asked her to send the information, and we'll continue to provide. We can maybe do a little analysis if it's required and send a report out to everyone.
Perfect. Okay, and with that, let me just, there was another thing I was going to say, and I've forgotten it in the context of this conversation. But I will note that next week we do not have, in lieu of a work session, we're having our annual strategic planning session. This session will not be conducted in person. Obviously, it would be done virtually the same way we're doing this here. We will not be taking public comment during this session, just like we do the same way as we do when we're meeting in person at the Benjamin Gaither Center for our strategic planning session. But you can view it the same way that you're viewing this meeting. And the next regular meeting of the Mayor Council will be on Monday, March 1st. And I will move it from the city manager.
Nothing else for me, Mayor. I was just going to add that for next week, we'll cover strategic direction, and we'll also review the city's framework for our internal citywide efforts to advance racial equity for the next year.
Thank you.
I have a quick question, Mayor, if I can.
Go right ahead.
So I'm just a bit confused that we are considering racial equity framework for our internal staff, but we as a council have not made a decision on what we're doing as a council to create a racial equity resolution, a framework. Tanisha's been here since September and she's already seen that they need it internally. And I'm just wondering where we're at. Like, we've seen models around the county. I've shared resolutions from neighboring jurisdictions, and I'm just wondering what we're waiting for. We have legislation before us, and we don't have a set framework to even, guide us through how we're going to arrive at the decision. I'm just asking for a formal process. And
Okay, I see Rob's hand up. Go ahead, Rob.
I don't know if you want to answer that question, Mr. Mayor, but based on my recollection, I think in one of the meetings where I was actually sitting next to Mike, and it's so long ago, maybe it wasn't, we'd actually discussed the framework for this, where again, Lorianne, you brought up the topic and the subject switched to, well, yeah, this is a great springboard into the planning retreat, which is actually coming up. And so that was what my understanding of the formal framework for having this discussion was, and just based on my recollection.
Mike?
Yeah, it was over a year ago that I said that we should be applying a racial equity lens to every aspect of the city operations as we can across the board. I raised it again at our retreat last year, and I think we began on the process. We started this other initiative associated with COG, where we have the cohort looking at these issues as well. But come next week, I'll be pressing again that we apply these goals and objectives to every aspect of our strategic plan and our process going forward. Whether we need a out of that, I would hope comes a resolution about how we deal with these things. But this isn't a new issue, and I don't think it's one we've been avoiding.
I brought the racial equity program to the city in 2018 when Towne was still here. The cohort graduated last summer, and we've yet to introduce a resolution. We have many examples, many samples. National League of Cities has templates. We have neighboring jurisdictions who took the lead and have already implemented those resolutions, and we cannot introduce a resolution without a 3-2 majority. So if you and I are on board to introduce a resolution, that's one thing. But if no one else is interested, then we will only have an internal process.
Well, I suggest we have that at the top of the agenda at our retreat.
I think you have a majority that's interested. I think we're just kind of waiting for the point of having a draft resolution in front of us that is, something that a majority of council and staff and all of our stakeholders working together to create a good product, is on board with. But I think I'm safe in saying, Council Member Sales, that you have a majority that's supportive of that approach. I think it's just a matter of getting to the final work product that we want, that truly and best captures what we want to do.
So I was told differently. So Tanisha, can you clarify this, please? Because
I'm not sure what you're asking me to clarify. Ryan's remarks? I don't-
Yeah, I'm not speaking for Tanisha, and maybe I'm throwing a wrench in the works here, but I think, to the extent that reflecting the decisions that we make and the policies that we want to adopt into the form of a resolution is the best way to go forward. And I think if it's, if I'm counting correctly, there's probably enough council members to go forward with that. It's just a question of what's that resolution look like and how does it align with the other the other projects that we want to do and the other programs that we want to do to address racial equity in the city.
Yeah. So if
I don't want to derail our agenda here, but I wanted to make sure that Councilmember Sales heard that.
All right. Thank you guys. As I understand it, because Tanisha and I have talked about this a little, this was on her plan to come up with the outline of a framework and propose it at the retreat, or at least discuss it at the retreat, right, Tanisha?
Yes, so racial equity, advancing our racial equity work internally is on our agenda for next week. I was going to preview our framework for our internal process, and that's just an outflow of the work that the racial equity cohort started. Obviously, it's an action item in the strategic direction plan to carry that work forward. And that's what we've been working on, preparing to do. So we're going to discuss the outline of that plan. Part of that plan, I didn't get an opportunity. I wanted to talk to you all ahead of the meeting, so we can do it now. But I was going to mention that as a part of the plan, many communities adopt at least an equity statement so that there's alignment between what the operation is doing internally and that there's, support from the elected body. So I was going to, demonstrate or show you all several different equity statements from across the country. I'm not sure if it will reflect what Lorianne is speaking to, or actually what any of you are speaking to. So for me, I thought it would be a starting point for, here are what some of the equity statements look like. And that was really just to be sure that, as we move this work forward internally, that there's support from mayor and council for that as well. And so the message is being sent, all the way through the organization. So that's on the agenda for next week.
Thank you, Tanisha. I'll just add that, the suggestion that there's a minority of the council that's in favor of moving forward on racial equity is a total mischaracterization of the way that this council has approached the issue. I'm not, Lorianne suggests that, over the last 3 years that she's been proposing resolution after resolution after resolution. I don't recall you suggesting a single specific one. If we get an email from you that says FYI and it's got a link to something, that's not the same as, crafting a resolution and saying I'm proposing this. So I was taking the emails that periodically have come as sort of like a for your information, not that what you were expecting was for somebody else to sort of pick it up and adapt it for use in the city of Gaithersburg. Can you clarify? Was that the expectation?
Well, my expectation is that our attorneys would craft a resolution for our consideration. I don't craft resolutions. That's not my background. So if there are models, there are templates out there that I've shared. If staff, just as they share many resolutions and ordinances with us, they want to introduce one for our consideration, I think that would be more appropriate. And I think that's what Tanisha was alluding to. It's just that my understanding was that what Tanisha was envisioning for next week's retreat was only going to impact work internally and not necessarily how we make decisions at the dais.
I guess I would add that you are mostly correct there in your assessment, Lori, and you and I have talked about this many times on our one-on-one calls, that I am working on the internal operation. And I think I've tried to be clear about that in every discussion that we've had. And what I'm suggesting, because the city council has not adopted a resolution to this point, that, if that was something you were interested in doing, that I was going to show you some examples of some equity statements and have that as a part of the work plan that we implement over the next year. I think there might be some misunderstanding about how the legislative process works. I mean, I would not walk through the door and propose or present a resolution for the council to adopt. I mean, it comes from the body. It doesn't come from us. And we obviously have routine operational things that get prepared because they impact the operation, and we need to buy things and sign contracts and those kinds of things. But these policy statements, it's to me, it's one of the purest forms of an elected body's work, that you would put forward a policy statement. So you have also shared some of those emails with me with templates and work that you've encountered across the country. And I've reviewed those as, educational pieces as I'm working toward reviewing what we'll do here in Gaithersburg and using it as education. I didn't understand any point in those emails, and I think maybe I'm sharing this with Judd, that you were expecting me to then draft a piece of legislation to bring forward to council. That's not how I was interpreting those messages at all. In fact, every conversation we've had about why there's not a resolution, I have said that, that needs to be a conversation with the mayor and council, which is what you all are doing tonight. So it's really not, it's not my call. It's not up to Lynn to just randomly draft something. It would need to be the result of a conversation and some direction back to staff to say, hey, we want this, here are the elements of it, drafted for our consideration.
I feel like we just heard 3 people say that they would be in agreement to consider a resolution, usually.
So, in as long as I've been on the council, there have been dozens of resolutions that council members have brought. Either they wrote themselves or they started with a template that was based on a resolution recommended by an organization such as the NLC or the MML, or an example of one passed by another city. We've brought it, we've made it fit Gaithersburg, and we didn't need until we got the gist of what the main objectives and elements of a resolution were going to be. Once we came up with that agreement, then it was up to our city attorney and city manager to make sure that everything that was in that resolution was appropriate to be in there, and that it wouldn't come back to haunt us. And I think I don't see why this is any different. If you want to bring a resolution, then you should share it with the rest of the council and say, here's what I think this resolution should say. That's what I've done in the past. It seems to have worked. We don't adopt every resolution that's proposed, but I think for the most part, that's been the process.
All right. Thanks, Mike. I want to give Neil a chance and Rob to weigh in, and then I want to get us back onto our agenda. Go ahead, Neil.
Oh, sorry, I'm going to stay off track, and just Lorianne, for your benefit, what's worked for me and what I've seen work for other people is not. I don't write resolutions either. I'm not an attorney. Wouldn't deign to, but I'm happy to write a set of bullet points of what I want in one, or talk to the right people. So for example, when I first brought to the city that I thought we weren't making any money on interest, and I was wondering if somebody was taking the interest and going to their bank account in Brazil, and realized what the process was, I outlined exactly what I thought should happen in terms of what was legal and what had worked in other organizations. And I know with Ryan, he brought in the bank on Gaithersburg and brought in the framework, and Mike with affordable housing and so on. You have to start with, this is what I want to see in the resolution. these are the straw man, here's the basic framework. And if you don't do that, nothing gets done. And maybe that's why you're being frustrated. I think you need to start by saying, here's what I think has worked for other people and what should be in a resolution. Let's turn it into something more formal and have something to talk about. That would
Rob,
be my
thank you.
suggestion.
We'll go to Rob.
Oh, I was just going to say that I've got the templates for resolutions and ordinances. I haven't drafted one in a while, so if you want to work together, Lorianne, we can. But again, because I didn't voice before, Ryan, I think, was articulating on my behalf that, yes, we had this conversation before. And I think the conversation went somewhere along the lines of Judd had issued a unilateral statement that was put on the website. We talked about a resolution, and then the decision was that we wanted something more, a holistic approach that would be ingrained in our strategic plan. And I thought that's where we had left it, is that we were going to take a hard look at an equity lens on our strategic plan, and that would be the action item, because that is our spoken statement for everything the city does. So just that was my recollection. Just wanted to throw that out there.
All right. We're going to table this discussion. It has been a good wide-ranging discussion here. And I'm going to move on to our economic development update. Tech team, if you could bring up Tom Lonergan, please, that'd be great. Welcome, Tom.
Welcome. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I just have one item for you tonight. Fitness Edge on Girard Street, Bevan's Grooming on East Diamond, Nothing But Cakes on Darnestown Road, and Island Pride Oasis on South Frederick Avenue. A favorite of mine. Their commonality, they are among the dozens of Black-owned businesses right here in the city of Gaithersburg that are contributing as much to our economy as they are the city's proud reputation as one of the nation's most diverse and welcoming communities. As we celebrate Black History Month, we do encourage our community to support the many entrepreneurs and innovative Black-owned businesses right here in Gaithersburg. Shopping Black-owned businesses is one of the most powerful actions that we can take to show our support. Not only can our patronage help those small businesses grow, but it puts the power directly into the hands of Black creators, employees, and consumers. Like so many other entrepreneurs in our community, they need our support now more than ever before. This year, the Economic Development Office will be working to establish and maintain a more comprehensive directory of Black and other small and minority-owned city enterprises so that we can better connect with them and that they may be more aware of grants, loans, networking, procurement, and other opportunities that might be available to them. I will be keeping you posted on our progress towards that end. And during Black History Month, I did want to mention that the Montgomery County Food Council is currently highlighting Black, Indigenous, and people of color and minority-owned Montgomery County-made businesses that are growing and producing some pretty amazing food and beverage products right here in our community. They've released their Black, Indigenous, and people of color-owned MoCo Made Business Guide. In this guide, you will find local farms, desserts, and other staples. You can check it out on the Food Council's website at mocofoodcouncil.org and learn how you can support them. That's really all I had for tonight, Judd, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you very much, Tom. We will move on to ordinances, resolutions, and regulations. Tech team, if you could bring up Pete Cottrell. We're going to talk about a resolution authorizing city manager to enter into a contract to purchase copiers, software, and maintenance. Pete, welcome. Rick, how are you doing? Welcome.
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Doing well, thank you.
Excuse me, I was muted. This is a resolution of the mayor and city council authorizing the city manager to enter into a contract to purchase Konica Minolta multifunction copiers, software, and maintenance. Tonight, I'm joined by Rick Rolls, the city's senior network operations specialist, who has been the lead staff member working on this project. The city's fleet of 21 Ricoh multifunction devices purchased in 2015 have reached the end of their useful service life. Due to the equipment's age and changing business requirements, the equipment needs to be replaced. The Information Technology Department has also identified 5 locations that would benefit from a more robust multi-function device. These locations are the Department of Public Works Modular Office, the Gaithersburg Community Museum, the Old Town Youth Center, the Robertson Park Youth Center, and the Wells Robertson House. As part of the installation process, the vendor will decommission and dispose of existing devices in accordance with Information Technology Department guidelines. Staff recommends the purchase of 26 Konica Minolta multifunction copiers and the PaperCut MF print management solution. In addition to the added capabilities at the 5 previously mentioned locations, this purchase will bring color printing capability to every city facility. Excuse me. 2 of the machines, one at City Hall and one at the Activity Center at Borough Park, will also have advanced finishing features to assist with the printing of brochures and mailers. All 26 machines are part of the Konica Minolta BizHub I-Series model line and will consist of a mix of 6 different models and a variety of options according to the needs and requirements of the staff at the different city locations. Staff recommends award to Konica Minolta Business Solutions USA, Inc., doing business as Meridian Imaging Solutions, Inc., for the purpose, installation, and ongoing maintenance of the multi-function devices. Meridian has been working with the city for the past 12 years in supplying and maintaining the city's copiers. Meridian's software specialists are familiar with the city's computing environment and IT staff. Their field technicians are familiar with city facilities and have received positive feedback from city users. This year, with COVID-19 pandemic initially shutting city facilities and then reducing staffing and the use of copiers, Meridian worked with city staff to change how quarterly maintenance billing was done, saving the city over $5,000. While the units are available to the city through a contract available via the U.S. Communities Purchasing Cooperative, Meridian has quoted a price approximately 23% lower than that contract pricing. Given the city's established satisfactory relationship with Meridian and substantial discount from the contract pricing provided by them, staff sought and were granted a best interest of the city procurement waiver to purchase the copiers, print management software, and services from Meridian at a cost not to exceed $178,000. This request for purchase was made as part of the fiscal year 2021 planning process, and there are sufficient funds in the IT and security asset replacement account. This concludes my presentation of the proposed resolution. May I answer any questions for you?
Any comments or questions? Thank you, Pete. If not, would someone like to move the resolution? Neil.
I move the resolution.
Okay. Rob.
I second the resolution.
Okay, I will call the roll. All in favor say aye. Any opposed say nay. Councilmember Sesma.
Aye.
Councilmember Harris.
Aye.
Councilmember Spiegel.
Aye.
Councilmember Sales.
Aye.
And Councilmember Wu.
Aye.
Okay, carries unanimously. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have, if we could bring up Tom Lonergan and Frank Johnson to talk about the RCN franchise agreement and transferring the name, I believe.
Did we skip something?
Did we? Yes, we did.
CDBG.
Excuse me.
CDBG.
Sorry, guys. Okay. Tech team, Tom, I'm sorry. We brought you here. We're going to send you away again.
Nope.
Tech team, can we bring up Louise Kaufman?
I'm sticking around for that.
Oh, you're sticking around for that. Okay, good.
Yes.
You're going to be around for a while then. Okay, we're going to talk about CDBG. Tech team. Okay, you got it. All right. Welcome, Louise.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, Council. Yes, tonight I am bringing before you a presentation on the CDBG and CDBG CV funds. for FY21. Tech team, can you please bring up the packet page 78? Thank you. This is the FY CDBG and CDBG CV, which stands for Coronavirus Funding Recommendations. Next page, please. The HUD Community Development Block Grants are very flexible funds. There are a few restrictions on how these funds can be used in a grantee's community, except that the overarching objective must be that we serve low and moderate income residents. And that is how the city spends its funds and has been spending its funds since the 1990s. The CARES Act allowed for HUD to make substantial changes to the CDBG program, specifically to eliminate caps on public service funds. We did convene our ad hoc task force to review these projects. And the next slide, I go into the funding and the projects. So next slide, please. So the HUD awards to the city are totaling over $1 million. We received our first CARES Act funding of $265,900. The City Council reviewed and approved those projects in June. We now have another $383,000 in CARES Act funding coming before us, and our ongoing CDBG annual award, and this current year, that award is $452,000. Next slide. So CDBG CV funds have one priority, which is that the funds and the activities must be used to prevent and respond to COVID-19. And when we brought the first round before the council, we asked that we fund a micro grant project. That project is currently underway. Also housing related assistance, which we thought at the time would be rental assistance and utility assistance, but it's been almost exclusively used for rental assistance. We have two nonprofit grants, one to family services and one to career catchers. And then we also put aside a small amount of money to cover some of the staff costs. Next slide. So what I'm bringing before you tonight are funds that HUD will reimburse the city for. These are eligible activities. Once the council approves them, we will bring them to HUD for final approval. As you all know, the city has a study bubble program that started in October. It is anticipated to last through the end of the school year, even with schools reopening. We average about $14,000 a month in part-time staff, which accounts for the $126,000. Housing related assistance, again, this is primarily rental assistance for very low income families who have been severely impacted by COVID. Mortgage assistance, we anticipate that some homeowners who have been affected by COVID could benefit from a month of mortgage assistance through this program, particularly our GALP borrowers, many of whom are already low income. And then we have about $35,000 in an undesignated fund, which means that as the needs arise and as we see how the funds are spent, we can move that money or create another activity depending on the needs. And again, this is a very staff intensive program, as you see just by the sheer number of activities. So I'm hoping that we can use our HUD allowed planning and admin funds to reimburse for staff. Next slide. So a regular CDBG award of the funds that we get from HUD For non-COVID related projects, we are requesting funds to do some infrastructure improvements in Old Town, housing related cost, rent assistance for people who are low income but not affected by COVID, our ongoing home buyer assistance loan program, and again, planning and admin, and a pilot ownership rehab program. We have not done this program as a grant before. We have a loan program where we use HIF funds to help homeowners do accessibility improvements to their property, but that program has never gotten off the ground. So I'm requesting that we create a pilot program to help existing homeowners do critical code improvements, code upgrades, or some other like HVAC, some other kind of urgent rehab and this will be funded by CDBG and will be done as a grant, not as a loan. Next. So as you all know, the impact of the crisis on low-income houses and rental housing has been particularly acute. Just sort of as an overview, 2 years ago, we used our CDBG funds and assisted 38 low-income households with rent and utility. Last year, 46 households. And just in the first 6 months of this fiscal year, we've already assisted 46 households. Next. So Family Services is a nonprofit contract to help us with the very time-consuming process of taking in all the documentations, working with the households, and of course, we're not meeting with people, so all of this is done by scanning or photos taken on their cell phones. So in addition to our own staff, we're using CDBG funds to contract with Family Services to assist with that process. And then a small grant to career catchers for job training and employment counseling for 15 households who are unemployed due to COVID. Although no households were assisted through December, we have 4 households currently undergoing the scholarship process. And this contract did not get underway until September, October. So it did take a while. Next slide, please. And the study bubble, the program takes, and I think you're all pretty familiar with the program. It takes place in 4 city-owned facilities. The program has served 46 low-income youth, city youth, and most of the city youth who are participating do live in zip code 20877. And as you are well aware, that is a zip code where there seems to be a lot of interrupted learning taking place. So it has met a critical need for our low-income students. The CDBG funds will cover the cost of the part-time staff and salaries, and city funds cover the full-time staff and other operating expenses. Next, please. And the emergency micro enterprise grant that you all approved in June for $100,000 of $5,000, a maximum of $5,000 for 20 businesses. We've received 19 applications as of the end of January and 3 have been approved. So next, please. And this is a new CDBG funded program that Tom has asked us to consider, targeting small businesses in Old Town. Old Town is a low and moderate income designated area. So it's certainly, appropriate to use CDBG funds for this activity. Lots of jurisdictions do this. We have not really done this in the past. But it would provide facade improvements, signage and other upgrades, and then some additional lighting in the Old Town Plaza and some enhancements to sidewalks. So we do not anticipate this project starting until July of 2021, but the funds will be awarded by HUD this year. Next, please. And the Homebuyer Assistance Program, our GALP program that has been so successful. Typically, we allocate about $260,000 a year in CDBG funds, but because I've seen that fewer HUD eligible households are able to purchase during COVID. So that's why I'm requesting fewer funds for this year's CDBG allocation for GALP. Next, please. And again, just as a recap, so over $1 million, 265,000 HUD was awarded in April, and those projects and contracts are in place and underway. Then another 383,000 for CDBG CV activities and 452,000 for our regular CDBG award. Next, please. So upon approval by the council, I will prepare a substantial amendment to our current CDBG plan to add this 383,000 in CV funds. I will prepare our regular action plan for HUD CDBG approval for 452,000, make those documents available for public comment. Any comments received must be incorporated into the amendment and the action plan and submitted to HUD. And then once approved by HUD, the city manager will execute grant agreements and we will start drawing down our funds. Next, please. So that's the end. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Louise. Do we have any questions or comments? Mike, go right ahead.
Thank you, Louise. That was pretty thorough. It looks like we're spending close to 450,000 directly for housing assistance and an additional, it looks like 75,000 for housing assistance through family services and others. I think this is our most important use of these funds. The more people we keep in their current housing, the less we have to provide services for if they become evicted residents, and that's a bigger stress on the system and a bigger stress on families, especially families with children. So, you know, I like the plan. It makes sense. I'd like to hear more about the micro grant program, but I guess you've only made 3 awards so far. So, you know, that was kind of the new thing that was proposed. But overall, I think this is a reasonable plan.
So just to remind you that the micro enterprise grant that is rolling out fairly slowly gives us plenty of time to spend these funds. We do not need to have them spent this year. And as for the housing assistance, most of the funds that I'm requesting are funds that will be spent over the next 6 to 9 months. But we're also really anticipating that the $31 million that's going to Montgomery County from the Department of Treasury, which we're not getting any of that money, will be used to support our households, our low-income households, to keep them housed.
That's good. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Neil, go ahead.
So I really like the program that you've presented. It's great that there's federal assistance available to increase our support for people in need. But I also really love the idea that there's an economic development component to this plan focused on Old Town, because Old Town, as we and I think a lot of people in today's audience know, we needs help, and these are the kinds of improvements that we've been looking for in Old Town. So if we can help drive some of that forward, it's basically planting seeds for the future. I think that will be very helpful. The rest of it, I mean, we need to help people get through this COVID situation. It's not of anybody's making, but it is causing hardship all around. So I think it's a great mix, and I applaud your efforts in putting this all together. Thank you.
Anyone else? Not, would someone like to move the resolution? Mike, go ahead.
I'll move the resolution.
Okay, Rob.
I'll second the resolution.
Okay, I will call the roll. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed say nay. Councilmember Sesma,
Aye.
Councilmember Harris,
Aye.
Councilmember Spiegel,
Aye.
Councilmember Wu,
Aye.
and Councilmember Sales.
Aye.
Carries unanimously. Thank you very much, Louise.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the RCN discussion, and I'd like to invite Frank Johnson. And essentially, we're approving a change of indirect control of the franchise because RCN was purchased. Is that correct? Is that what's happened here?
That's correct, Mr. Mayor. Frank Johnson, our Deputy City Attorney, is here joining me tonight, but I'll be introducing the resolution, which is before you to change the indirect control of the franchise under the RCN Telecom Services Cable Franchise Agreement. City has been notified that Stone Peak Infrastructure Partners has entered into an agreement to acquire Star Power Communications, but doing business as RCN. Their letter states that although indirect control of the community's franchisee will change, the franchise will continue to be held by the same legal entity that holds the franchise today and will continue to provide service pursuant to that franchise. Furthermore, the same company that manages the system today will continue to do so under ownership and indirect control of Stone Peak. Deputy City Attorney Johnson has reviewed the application and sees no objections to the proposed transfer or resolution. He has determined that this purchase agreement will change the primary investor, but will not affect services for any city customers or the franchise with the city. In short, this purchase will not change local control with no change to local operations or services, which would of course be our key concern. According to FCC rules, if we take no action on this request, the application will be deemed granted within 120 days. However, City Code does require that such approval under section 6.3 of the City Code states that no franchise may be transferred without the approval of the council by resolution duly enacted. And that's what's here before you tonight. And Frank and I are here to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you both very much. Do we have any questions or comments? Ryan, go ahead.
I'll just say briefly that this strikes me as a reasonable belt and suspenders approach. We could wait around, I guess, for the application to be deemed accepted, but we might as well just go ahead and pass the resolution now. And, there's going to be no impact on the actual franchise or the terms of the agreement itself.
Yep. Neil.
Move the resolution.
Second.
Okay. I will call the roll. All those in favor say aye. Any opposed say nay. Councilmember Sesma.
Aye.
Councilmember Harris.
Aye.
Councilmember Spiegel.
Aye.
Councilmember Sales.
Aye.
And Councilmember Wu.
Aye.
Okay, carries unanimously. Thank you both again.
Thank you.
And tech team, we're going to move on to the next item, which is about the text amendment sponsorship. And can we bring up Kirk Eby, please? Kirk, welcome. Thank you for your patience in getting here. Take it away.
All right, thank you. Well, good evening, Mayor and City Council. Tonight, staff is seeking sponsorship of a text amendment to the zoning ordinance, Chapter 24, to define cremation services and indicate in which zones the use will be allowed by right, restricted to conditional use, or prohibited. As background, in October of 2020, the Mayor and City Council denied application SP-8415-2020, which requested in part to add accessory cremation facilities to an expansion of an existing funeral home. The foundation of the denial was that the crematory aspect of the specific proposal was neither in the public interest nor compatible with the surrounding residential uses, which was shown by the extensive stakeholder input into the record. During their deliberations, the council suggested that staff revisit the zoning ordinance and make future amendments to the city code to address these types of cremation services. The text amendment being introduced tonight is primarily a housekeeping amendment to restrict where the cremation use is allowed as an accessory use to a funeral home. Currently, cremation services are allowed as an accessory use to funeral homes in all zones where a funeral home is allowed as a use, and the addition of a crematorium would only require an interior fit-up permit unless there were other changes to the funeral home, such as a building addition or expansion into another building. The proposed text amendment will establish when cremation services will be allowed by right as an accessory use to a funeral home, when a conditional use permit will be required for such an accessory use, and when it will be a prohibited use. I would now like to walk you through the proposed text amendment. So the text amendment proposes to add a definition for cremation services, which can either be a standalone use or associated with a funeral home use. The proposed amendment modifies the definition of a funeral home to clarify the activities that may be allowed as part of the funeral home's operation, including cremation services. The definition of funeral home is also being expanded to include funeral parlors because the zoning ordinance refers to them sort of as funeral homes or funeral parlors, so that brings them both into compliance with this. Standalone cremation services will be allowed only in the I3 zone and only as a conditional use. And so that avoids, with the floating zones, that avoids the use being allowed in them by right, because those zones don't allow other uses by right unless they're allowed by right in another zone. Cremation services that are part of a funeral home's operation will be allowed by right in the RO, CP, C2, CBD, and CD zones, as long as the funeral home property does not abut or confront and is not adjacent to residential uses. And just a quick note that there actually is not any land that's zoned RO or CP in the city at this time. However, staff wanted to make sure that the ordinance reflected, future potential zoning of land in the RO or CP zone. Cremation services that are part of a funeral home's operation will be allowed as a conditional use in the CP, C2, CBD, and CD zones if the funeral home property abuts, confronts, or is adjacent to residential uses. By tying the conditional approval to a residential use rather than a residential zone, such conditional approval of cremation services will only be in effect for those funeral homes that are next to actual residences. Funeral homes with crematoriums that are completely surrounded by non-residential uses, like parks or religious facilities, would still be allowed by right in the CP, C2, CBD, and CD zones. Within the MXD zone, funeral homes will only be allowed as conditional use. Currently, in the MXD zone, funeral homes are allowed only as a special exception use. So by making them a conditional use, that'll be consistent with the conditional use for a crematorium, which also in the MXD zone, cremation services that are part of a funeral home's operation, those could be included as part of the funeral home's overall conditional use approval if that property does not abut or confront and is not adjacent to residential property. However, if the funeral home property does abut or confront or is adjacent to residential uses and offers a cremation services, then a separate conditional use approval would be required. And in the RO zone, cremation services that are part of a funeral home's operation are prohibited if that funeral home property does abut, confront, or is adjacent to residential uses. And in any of the other zones that I didn't mention tonight, the cremation services will remain a prohibited use. So staff is recommending that the City Council make a motion to sponsor this text amendment to add cremation services to the zoning ordinance and schedule a joint public hearing for Monday, March 15th, 2021. And with that, I'm ready for any questions you may have.
All right, Kirk, just one question, because for any of the public who's trying to follow this, there was a dense amount of information.
Yes.
With different zones. So let me just try to ask this simply. This text amendment, would this text amendment, I'm forming it into a question, make it so that a crematorium, crematory services, could only be allowed anywhere where it's next to, adjacent to residential or confronting or abutting residential in any of our zones? It's crematory services would either be not allowed or would only be allowed as a conditional use, which essentially means we'd have to go through a public process.
Yes, that is correct.
And that is essentially, we're tightening up a situation where the existing code could allow crematory use just as a by right. It wouldn't come before us. There wouldn't be a public process. This is tightening that up to clarify that anytime there's residential anywhere near where someone might want to put a crematorium, there would have to be a public process or it's not allowed.
That is correct.
Okay,
that is correct.
I just want to clarify that. Okay, Mike, go ahead.
Okay, Kirk, thank you. It was very helpful there. The Old Town is considered a CBD along East Diamond, correct?
Yes, it is zone CBD.
Okay, there is a funeral home at the corner of Park and East Diamond, correct?
Yes.
Okay, is that adjacent or abutting or confronting residential zone? Or residential area? I guess that's,
Right. I believe there's an apartment building in that general area. I don't have the map
so
up
then we
with
have to
right
get to
now,
the,
but
define what confronting, adjacent and abutting means.
right. And for that, I will actually defer to Frank or Lynn to answer that, because I'm sure there'll be all sorts of related questions, such as if somebody has a lot and they decide to create a small strip of land between their lot and the next lot, is that enough to separate them and not make them adjacent or confronting? So if Lynn or
Yeah,
Frank could jump
it
in.
would be helpful to understand whether or not that existing funeral home, which does not abut or confront or is adjacent to a residential lot, could put in a crematorium.
Lynn, do you want to help with that question?
Sure. For this particular use, like Kirk, I don't have the zoning map up in front of me. So, I would certainly want to take a look and confirm what the surrounding uses and properties are zoned in order to answer that specific question. But in Maryland, there is quite a bit of case law that interprets what those words mean, abutting, adjoining, confronting. So it is an issue that has been, vetted fairly thoroughly by the Maryland courts. For each of those specific terms, there is a kind of different accepted use. Generally, they are what you would common sense be as like a touching of the property, of one property to another, but for some of them, there's a little bit more detailed definition. I think certainly before the public hearing, we can put together in a memo exactly how the courts have interpreted each of those terms to see if we need to have a more expansive definition.
Yeah, well, it's I think it's the only other funeral home in the city of Gaithersburg, if I'm not mistaken. But the CBD could have other properties that could be, I suppose a funeral home could be established within that. And a number of those properties along East Diamond are not adjoining or confronting residential properties. So conceivably, it could be possible then for a property like that, a business like that, to include a crematorium. And so it sounds like there's still a possibility, even though it might only be 100 feet away. I assume 100 feet is not adjacent, adjoining, or confronting. Anyway, so that's why I've asked that question, and I don't know whether we need to be more precise in introduction or expansive at introduction or less. So.
Okay, we'll go to Rob and then Lorianne.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And so I agree with Mike that the definitions of abutting, adjacent, and confronting should be defined. And then the question becomes, because we use those terms elsewhere in our code, do we do a general definition or do we do just for the subsection? And then other question would be kind of a policy question, is what is the rationale behind making the use that where it abuts adjacent to or confronting residential as conditional, but allowing it by right in other circumstances? Why not just make it all conditional within the city, within zones where it is contemplated? And that's to Rob, Kirk, or John.
When we were doing this, what it was really based upon, obviously Kirk and I came very late to the discussion, but it was talking with Greg Mann in community planning. And it was trying to get an understanding of what were the issues related to that previous application. And what it sounded as if it was really the neighborhood and their concerns. So as we were looking at it, essentially we weren't, we understood the guidance that had been received was the council had no interest in specifically prohibiting these uses outright. It was trying to find a solution. So that's why we really sat down and looked at, well, if the concerns were on a community level, how do we address community concerns? We thought conditional use. But again, thinking big picture and looking at the zoning ordinance, every place where these uses are allowed, say this was in a C2 zone and, for whatever reason, it was in, a commercial park, does that really warrant, that doesn't abut residential, does that really warrant having to do the conditional use? That's what our thinking was. We're not saying, obviously if the council feels different, we're not saying that was the correct. We were just trying to approach this, trying to address, to our understanding, what the issues were with that previous application.
Okay, and so what about, let me just throw this out there as an alternative. Is what about putting a distance requirement from the either the lot line or from the incinerator, because lots can be different sizes. Conditional use within 500 feet of residential or something like that.
It is funny you mentioned that, because we did this exercise in our own as we were coming up with this. We did 500 feet and we did 1,000 feet. And it basically makes every place where this zone is there, it basically makes it a required conditional use. So there would be no sense in really doing that distance. It would just be easier in a sense, just to make these conditional uses in the zones where it's currently allowed.
So we have commercial C2, for example, that doesn't abut, isn't adjacent to, and isn't confronting residential, but is within
500 feet of residential.
Or 100 feet.
North Frederick Avenue.
So why doesn't it just say that then, instead of adjoining, abutting, confronting?
Well, I want to keep order here. Mike, we'll get back to you, but I want to go to Lorianne first and then Neil, then we'll get back to you, Mike. Go ahead, Lorianne.
Thank you, Mayor. So that was my question. I do recall, I thought in the last time we discussed this, there was a certain amount of feet between the property and the next residential property. And I was looking for that. I thought it was 50 feet, but I'm just wondering why it wasn't included in this version.
Rob, do you want to address that?
Again, not being party, we weren't made aware that there was ever a discussion about a 50 feet. On our own, we decided to explore the 500 and the 1,000. And again, where we saw that, it was our understanding that the concern with this was really related to residential uses. It wasn't concerns about the use itself when it doesn't, fall within. Again, this is, why we're doing sort of the sponsorship. If the direction is to go back and amend and, re-sponsor something that makes this a conditional use in every zone, we're happy to do that. Again, we were just working off what we understood, what the concerns were coming out of that previous application.
Okay. So.
Okay, we're going to go to Neil, then Mike, then Rob.
So in terms of understanding what the concerns were, I'm not sure we're entirely on the same page. Yeah. So, and in listening to some of the testimony earlier from the public, excuse me, I think that, what was prevalent in the discussion from the public at the previous hearings on this, on the proposed crematorium at Duval, was that most people in the public, and I think members of the council, or at least myself, felt that it was appropriate to put a use like this in a zone that is meant for industrial uses, but not so much for the other zones. So the question is it possible to prohibit it much more broadly but allow it in zones where industrial uses are appropriate?
Academically, yes, but right now funeral homes aren't allowed in the industrial zones. So again, it would be a text amendment that is now, we can do whatever the direction is.
All right,
And
I don't
just-
really have a further comment. I think that seems to be sensible to me. I'm not sure why it's prohibited from an industrial zone, but maybe somebody else that has more experience with these things could weigh in.
Okay, we'll go to Mike and then Rob.
So isn't the county, doesn't the county allow funeral homes or crematoria in industrial zones? Isn't that what they changed?
I do not know. We did not research that. I mean,
All right.
we can obviously, if this moves forward, we can be prepared to answer these questions for the public hearing.
Okay, the reason I'm focused on this issue of adjoining, abutting, confronting is basically that property that I identified earlier is within 500 feet of residential properties. The other part of it is, I think, if you go back and read the cover sheet, it said the foundation of denial was that the crematory aspect of the proposal was neither in the public interest nor compatible with existing proximate residential uses. So it says proximate residential uses. Proximate, I assume, means some distance rather than adjoining, abutting, confronting. That's how I understand it. And that's why I focused on those words rather than proximate residential uses or compatible and in the public interest. I mean, those are the issues that we decided on when this came under consideration earlier this year. So, or earlier, I'm sorry, in the fall of 2020. So I think that's the language that should probably be incorporated here rather than the specific language, so that we don't have to argue about and change every definition for adjoining, abutting, and confronting everywhere else in the code. I think we can do something a little bit more here.
Okay,
well, the easiest would be to make these conditional uses, this specific accessory use, a conditional use everywhere. Because again, as we had mentioned in the memo included in the packet, one of the things we do like about the conditional uses is the findings address everything Councilmember Sesma just brought up. So, the onus is on the property owner to do that. Okay. Again, why we sort of said, not doing that right away. We understand the community that was part of that application, made their feelings known. We're trying to think also longer term, this may be proffered in the future near a community that doesn't have the same concerns. So that's why we didn't want to prohibit it outright. Again, we were trying at the best of our understanding to address what was there, but it sounds as if, it may be more realistic just to make these conditional uses. And again, I understand the concerns about the CD zone, but again, taking the long picture, if the goal eventually is to expand the CD zone up and down Frederick Avenue, there's going to be sections of it that don't back onto residential uses. So we were trying to get everything covered, and if we didn't quite hit it, we apologize about that. But
I understand, but even if something doesn't directly abut a property, it's still proximate to a residential zone, and that's it's the use of the word proximate and what our definition of that is, rather than a direct connection.
Okay.
And so my question is then, do we need to make this more expansive at this point before we introduce it, or can we work with it as it is and change the wording? Are we going to have the opportunity to do that, or are we going to have to go back and then reintroduce later to incorporate these ideas and these thoughts?
If it's going to be more restrictive, we probably would have to do it now rather than later. John, you had your hand up, and then Rob.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of get Rob and Kirk off the hook a little bit because they weren't involved in the Duval application. That was community planning and Greg Mann and Jasmine. But I mean, our whole intent here was really the whole abutting, confronting, adjoining, adjacent issue. Maybe we have to define that better. But
Can I just suggest something and see if the council, by show of hands, would be amenable to it? And you guys could tell me, staff, if this is realistic or not. But I can't see a scenario in which the council is going to want to allow crematorium anywhere where there's residential, anywhere other than essentially an industrial zone. So is it possible to say to table this for now, but come back with the redrafted text amendment that says we're going to allow funeral homes in the as a use in industrial zone if they want, and that would be the only place where there's a potential for a crematorium, and there it would be conditional use. Is that what does staff think about that?
That is doable. I just want to make sure I'm clear. So we would allow funeral homes to exist in the zones they're allowed to exist in. They just couldn't have crematory facilities as an allowable accessory use under the definition.
Right. Only if a new funeral home crops up in an industrial zone, could they come to us for permission to have a crematorium by, condition.
Yes, I understand. So again, you're then asking us to change the amendment to allow funeral homes in the industrial zones, which, is not a big deal. It's just changing that. From a practical standpoint, to be upfront, from looking at the zoning map, we don't have many industrial zones left. Properties, and those properties probably won't encumber this. I mean, a lot of our I-3, is related to the Monument campus, and it's related to FedEx. So, by putting it there, some ways, I don't know how much of an opportunity you're really offering.
Well, I'm not sure the council wants to offer a lot of opportunity for crematoria in the city.
That's great. That's sort of the guidance. It was our understanding that, that we were under the impression that there was a different.
I'm going to take now John, Rob, and Kurt off the hook because I thought that I had heard, and I came in at the tail end of this debate when I came in September, but I thought that I had heard we were trying to balance some of the business interest here while we, keep these kind of uses away from residential. So we were attempting to balance them because the alternative is basically there won't be any in the city practically based on how we're laid out currently.
I think we do want to be business friendly at the same time, just gauging from my gauging of the council members. I don't know. Am I getting this wrong, council members?
No, you're on the right track.
Neil, go ahead.
Well, I think you're coming from the exact same place I was coming from. And let me just give some background. So I grew up, as many of you know, in Philadelphia. And so I was less sensitive to this because there were funeral homes and crematoria mixed in with residential neighborhoods because that was basically everything was residential except for a few strips of factories by the river. But what I saw from the public here in Montgomery County and in Gaithersburg in particular, and what I heard talking to people more broadly in the county is that offering to put a crematoria into this county anywhere near where people live is going to just be an invitation to major controversy that's not going to end up happily. So I think that realistically, where we are in geographically and culturally, putting something like this near people's homes is just not going to happen. So why make it a conditional use if we're always going to have to end up saying no? I think putting it in an industrial area makes much more sense. And I know we don't have that many, but maybe characterizing it as industrial is too narrow, and we could look at the zoning map and find some other zones, some of the commercial zones where it might be appropriate. For those in the public, I know, I think one of you mentioned that they didn't know what zones were where. If you go to the GaithersburgMD.gov website and go to the search bar and search for zoning map, I think it's the second thing that comes up. There's a whole page where it's a very, very complex map, but you can see where all the different zones are, and there's a pretty good color scheme and key that tells you what's what. Anyway, that's my long answer to the short question. Sorry.
Thanks, Neil. We'll go to Rob.
Thanks, Mayor. And my thought was kind of where Neil's was, I'm not wedded to industrial zone, but, where would it be appropriate? And what comes to mind is, like, for example, Perry Parkway. You've got, rationalizing in my head, a biotech may have the same types of emissions as a crematorium. I don't know that for a fact, but what I'm thinking is more, it's not appropriate for residential to be within any distance of residential where it's downwind, upwind, wherever wind, but just trying to think through where in the city it could be appropriate. That was the first area that came to mind.
Okay, that's a fair point. So when I say industrial, I want you guys to interpret that a little wider than just an I3 zone or whatever. I want you guys get the point. Kirk, go ahead.
Yeah, I just from staff, I'd like to clarify. So if we are going to restrict them to industrial zones and perhaps these other sort of R&D type zones, would the council also want to have some sort of restriction on how close they can be to residential? For example, if it's in an I3 zone, but it's it borders a residential zone or a residential use. I'm thinking kind of down by the GE Tech Park area and Hidden Still Creek Lane, that kind of area. Would you still want to have some sort of restriction on either making it conditional use or just prohibiting it? I mean, I guess we kind of want some guidance on which way you would lean.
Good question. We'll let Mike take a shot at it first.
So that was why I used the word I took it right off the cover sheet, proximate. Proximate to residential. So I think we can define to some extent what proximate means. It doesn't mean adjacent, abutting, confronting. It means something more than that. So
you've been very clear on the word proximate.
I think we have an I3 zone at Chestnut and Old Town Avenue, right? The old steel company.
Yeah, so come up with a number of feet away from residential. In addition, okay.
Yes, because of our exercise, just so we're clear again, because most of our Euclidean zones, just about every one of these zones is within 500 feet of a residential use.
Well,
so, again, we just want to be clear that if we're saying, we don't want it, this isn't appropriate, that's a different direction to this text amendment, and it is much easier in a sense that was sort of brought up earlier to basically prohibit this accessory use.
If it's proximate to a residential zone. So if you want a number, okay, I'll throw a number out there, 500 feet.
500, okay, Neil, go ahead.
Just a quick question for Rob. Are you saying that there is no spot within a commercial or similar zone that is more than 500 feet from a residence? Or are you saying that there's no zone that's more than 500 feet?
We did an analysis of the various properties. And Kirk, you might be able to help me. I think maybe out of all of the C2, all of the CD, the other zones mentioned in the text amendment, I think only one property cleared the 500-foot hurdle. Everything else was within 500 feet. Now, we didn't include I3, but I think with the exception of FedEx on Monument Campus, that's probably within, potentially 500 feet of the residential at Spectrum. When you jump to the other side of I-270, even on West Watkins Mill, you may have some, but once you get, there's all residential on the other side of Diamond and you have residential at the Parklands. So again, it's looking, so.
Yeah, I think what Rob's getting at is.
We'll do this analysis. If we come back, we will have answers for you specifically with graphics. But, my sense is right now, we're 500 feet even limits the pool even further.
Right, and I think what Rob's getting at is there also may be a difference between 500 feet from a property line versus 500 feet from the actual crematoria facility. So if you're on a big chunk of land like FedEx, which we wouldn't expect that use to go there, but it's a large enough piece that if it was, sited in the middle of it, it may be 500 feet from the property boundary, of that one parcel, and certainly would be more than 500 feet from an actual residential use. So I guess
but traditionally, these are all measured from the property lines.
Correct.
All right. If I still have the floor, while I am a proponent of economic development, and that means trying to accommodate businesses and economic growth in the city, it may be a case where this is not appropriate here and where there's plenty of spot. I mean, we're not in an island, right? We're surrounded by areas, and including, you know, the areas around the air park and Goody Drive and things like that, that are industrial and not residential, that may be more appropriate for this sort of use just outside the city limits. So that's probably worth thinking through.
I guess staff would ask the city attorneys whether prohibiting the use completely would raise any sort of constitutional issues related to like religious freedom and things like that.
All right, we'll go to Lynn and then John. Go ahead, Lynn.
I mean, I think that there could be a somewhat of a RLUIPA argument if we completely prohibited the use from the city. So, you know, I think if we do allow it in some industrial zones, that we would be in a better position.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. John.
Okay, I was just going to say, which is what I was going to finish with earlier, is that the whole point of this text amendment is to give the control of whether or not this is an appropriate use within any of these zones to the mayor and council. So through the conditional use process. So that was the point. That was the point of this text amendment.
Yeah, we understand that. Rob, go ahead. Rob Wu.
Oh, thank you. I was looking down at.
All right, there's two Robs. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I mean, again, my concern is the proximity of the emission from residential. And so, you know, to the extent that that's the driving concern, I'd be okay with conditional uses elsewhere in the city that are outside of a certain distance from residential. And I think I would be more inclined, to the extent it's feasible. You know, we have like setback requirements. You know, the point of emission is 500 feet, or point of emission is 400 feet, not necessarily from the property line. To the extent that, you know, I don't know if I see smoke coming off Rob's head right now as I.
No.
That would be my inclination.
All right, so Tanisha, do you think that we have enough guidance here to sort of go back to the drawing board on this?
I may need to run the tape back a bit, but yes, I mean, I think where staff was trying to say is if we go through the exercise of putting these distances in, it's probably easier to go the other route, because it's going to end up precluding the use in pretty much all of the Euclidean zones by putting in a buffer of any amount, less or greater than what was suggested here. So we were on the glide path that I put the team on, thinking we were trying to balance that, you know, we might want to have funeral homes have the ability to grow their business in that way, and in a place that does not impact the residential use that's proximate to that use. And so that was what we were attempting to do. Obviously, that is not what the council wants us to do. So we will run the tape back and we will come back with something different.
Okay. Well, at least it's only 11 o'clock at night. We've come to this resolution. Thank you all, planning staff, Kirk, John, Rob, Frank. So we'll table this issue. Is there anything from the city attorney?
Nothing further this evening.
Okay. And I heard from Dennis, there wasn't anything more from him. Anything from any other staff I see on screen? If not, then I will remind everybody that we have our strategic planning session next week. Feel free to join us, but there will not be public comment taken at that meeting. And our next regular meeting of the Mayor and Council is on Monday, March 1st. And until next time, let's do great things, Gaithersburg. We are adjourned.